sky was choked with an unrelenting ash, suffocating every breath we took. The air hung heavy, as if the world itself had succumbed to the weight of endless war. The battlefield stretched before me, an endless expanse of scarred earth, twisted wreckage, and craters filled with dark, stagnant water. I had been on this forsaken planet for what felt like years, though it had only been a few months. Every day here was the same, a relentless grind and the weight of an eternal storm pressing in from every side. "Corvin, you're staring again," came the voice of Miri, the squad's tactical officer. Her tone was sharp, like she had said it 1,000 times before. It pulled me from my thoughts, and I blinked, focusing on her. "I was thinking," I muttered, lifting my rifle and adjusting the straps. My fingers trembled, but I didn't let her see. She raised an eyebrow but didn't press further. "That's what you do, and if you do too much thinking, you'll start questioning whether it's worth it. Trust me, it's not." I didn't have a retort for that. Miri had always been pragmatic, almost cold in her views on the war. She had her reasons, I had mine, but lately the reason I kept fighting had been slipping away, like sand through my fingers. The fog rolled in thick from the east, swirling around the trench, swallowing everything in its path. The usual sounds of distant artillery were muted by the eerie silence that seemed to hang in the air today. Even the crickets and the occasional wind had stopped, as though nature itself had been silenced in anticipation of something far worse. "Miri, you feel that?" I asked, lowering my voice. It was more of a hunch, a feeling that prickled at the back of my neck. Something wasn't right. She glanced around, her gaze narrowing. "It's just the fog. Happens every time we get close to the front lines." But I saw the doubt flicker in her eyes. She wasn't entirely convinced. We moved on, deeper into the trench, where a few other soldiers were preparing their gear. The fog had thickened, and the light from our lanterns barely cut through it. Everything felt off, like we were walking through a dream that had long since lost its meaning. The world beyond our trench was a blur, just a void of darkness and mist. "Corvin, a word!" came a voice behind me. It was Thale, our squad's leader. He was taller than most, with a weathered face that spoke of too many years in the trenches. He didn't need to say more. I knew something was wrong when he said my name like that, urgent but calm, as if he had already made his peace with whatever came next. I followed him to a quieter corner of the trench where the others couldn't hear us. "What is it, Thale?" I asked, my voice low. Reports came in from the southern flank. Something's not right. Civilians are reporting sickness, strange mutations, people acting wrong. I frowned. The usual whispers in the trenches had escalated, but this was something new, something worse. "Is it the enemy?" I asked, already knowing the answer. "No," he replied, his voice dropping to a whisper. "They've ruled that out. It's not their work. Whatever it is, it's something else, something we don't understand yet." I took a deep breath. "What are we supposed to do about it?" Thale rubbed his forehead, his fingers trembling. "We wait for orders, but I've got a bad feeling about this, Corvin. Something's coming." Before I could respond, the air shifted. A distant rumble echoed in the fog. At first I thought it was artillery, but the sound wasn't quite right. It was too irregular, too unnatural. Then it came again, this time closer. "What the hell is that?" Miri's voice cut through the tension, her hand already gripping her rifle. Thale motioned for us to stay low, his eyes scanning the distance. "Stay alert. Whatever it is, we aren't ready for it yet." The ground beneath us vibrated slightly, a tremor, just faint enough to be mistaken for a trick of the mind. Then there it was again, the faint sound of something scraping against the walls of the trench, faint but persistent. It was as though the earth itself was breathing. I turned to Miri, our eyes meeting for just a moment. Her face was pale, but she didn't flinch. "What is it?" she whispered, though we both knew she was asking a question without an answer. "I don't know," I replied, my voice barely audible. but we're about to find out. The sound grew louder, a low growl that seemed to come from beneath the ground. Something was moving beneath us. I heard it before I saw it, a whisper in the fog, distorted, almost incomprehensible, but unmistakably human. "Corvin, over here." I froze. My heart slammed against my chest, my breath catching in my throat. It was faint, distorted, like the voice was coming through the fog from far away, but I was certain it was calling my name. "Daly," I hissed, grabbing his arm. "Did you hear that?" Daly's eyes widened and his fingers tightened on his laser gun. "I heard it too. Stay calm, Corvin." Miri was already moving toward the sound, her rifle raised, scanning the fog. "We need to check it out now." "No," Thale said sharply, grabbing her arm. "We don't move without orders." But Miri's eyes were already darting in the direction of the voice. She wasn't listening anymore. Her instincts were kicking in. Her sense of survival was louder than any orders could be. The whisper came again, this time louder. "Corvin, over here." I couldn't ignore it anymore. I stepped forward, my boots sinking into the wet, murky earth beneath me. There was something primal in my chest telling me to turn back. But I didn't. The others followed. We crept through the mist, my rifle at the ready, my heart pounding in my ears. Every step felt heavier than the last, and the air thickened around us, pushing down on my chest. As we reached the bend in the trench, the sound stopped. Silence. The kind of silence that makes your skin crawl. Then we saw it. A figure in the distance, just beyond the fog, standing motionless. It looked like a guardsman, though something was terribly wrong with the silhouette. I could almost make out the shape of a helmet, but the figure seemed off, out of place. The stance wasn't right. The way the figure tilted its head, unnatural. And then it was gone. I blinked, and in the span of a breath, it vanished into the mist, like it had never been there. I heard Thala swear under his breath. "We're not alone," he said quietly. "Stay sharp." The fog hung thick around us, clinging to our faces like wet cloth, making every breath feel heavy. The whisper had vanished just as quickly as it had come, but its echo lingered in the back of my mind, like a shadow I couldn't shake off. The figure, if it had been a figure at all, had disappeared into the mist, leaving us with nothing but a sense of cold unease. I tried to steady my breathing, but it wasn't easy. Every slight movement of the fog felt like something watching us, waiting. Miri had already started moving again, her sharp eyes scanning the trench ahead. "We need to keep moving," she said, her voice tight. "No use standing here like targets." I nodded, but my feet felt like lead. I was still looking in the direction where the figure had been, half expecting it to reappear. But nothing did. Thyle was at the front, his usual confident stride slower now, a frown furrowing his brow. He turned back to us, his hand raised for us to stop. "We need to report this," he said, his voice low but insistent. "But we're too exposed here. Let's fall back and set up in the next dugout. There's no reason to be this far out with nothing to show for it." No argument there. I could barely keep my eyes off the mist as we made our way back, heading for the relative safety of a deeper section of the trench. The deeper we went, the quieter it became. The fog thickened the further we descended, until the trench was nearly pitch black except for the dull glow of our lanterns. The usual clamor of distant gunfire and explosions was muted, leaving only the muffled sound of our boots squelching through the mud. Something wasn't right. "Anyone else feel like we're being watched?" I asked, my voice low and edged with a tension I couldn't shake. Miri gave a glance over her shoulder, her eyes narrowing. "That's just paranoia, Corvin. Everyone's feeling it. The fog does that to you. That and the stress." "Maybe," I muttered, but I wasn't convinced. "The fog feels too thick, like it's got a purpose." We reached the dugout, a small reinforced structure dug into the side of the trench. A couple of our men were already there, staring out through the narrow gaps in the sandbags, their faces tense. "Nothing out there," one of them muttered as we entered. "But it's like the world's holding its breath, like something's coming." I barely heard him. I was too focused on the strange, gnawing feeling that had taken root in my chest. Miri set up her rifle against the wall and leaned her head against the wooden support beams of the dugout. "What do you think it is?" she asked Thaler, her voice almost bored, though I knew she was just trying to mask the unease we all felt. Thale sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "I don't know. Whatever it is, it's not something we've faced before. These strange reports from the southern sectors, that whisper, that figure. The infection might have spread further than we thought." "I'm not buying the infection theory," Miri said, shaking her head. "It doesn't feel right. This is something else, something darker." I was silent, but I couldn't help but agree. The planet itself felt off. It wasn't just the fog. It was the way everything seemed to hang in stasis, like we were on the edge of something huge, something inevitable. "What are the others saying?" I asked, my mind unwilling to rest. "The command." Thale frowned. "Nothing concrete yet. They're pulling in reinforcements from the Western Front, but that's about it. Orders are to hold the line and report anything unusual." "Well, now we've got unusual. All we've got is time and more waiting." The words felt hollow. The fog seemed to press in, thickening around us like a presence. Something was happening. I could feel it in my bones. But what? A plague, the work of the enemy, or something far more sinister? A faint rumble from far away caught my attention, distant at first, but quickly growing louder. It was a sound I hadn't heard before, a low, unsettling hum that seemed to vibrate through the very air itself. "What in the Emperor's name is that?" I muttered, my hand instinctively moving to my lasgun. Thaler stiffened, his face hardening. "It's not artillery," he said, his voice taut with growing tension. "This is something different." The hum grew louder and the ground beneath us trembled. It wasn't an earthquake, not like the aftershocks we'd felt before. This was deliberate, methodical. I stared at the walls of the dugout, my senses straining to hear over the thudding of my heartbeat. And then it hit me. The hum wasn't coming from the outside. It was coming from below. "The tunnels," I whispered. "There's something beneath us." Miri's hand shot out to grab my arm. "Stay calm," she said, though her voice didn't quite match her words. "It could be something harmless." But she was cut off by a loud crack from somewhere beneath the earth. It was followed by another, and then another, the sound echoing in the trench like the creaking of an old dying creature. Something was moving under us, something alive, and whatever it wasn't friendly. "Get ready," Thale ordered, his voice steady despite the panic creeping into his eyes. "We're not alone. Whatever it is, it's coming for us." I tightened my grip on my lasgun and crouched down, my heart hammering in my chest. We had no idea what was below us, but if it was anything like the whispers, we were in for a hell of a fight. The ground shook again, this time much more violently. The walls of the dugout seemed to groan under the pressure. And then, with a horrifying screech, the floor beneath us cracked open, sending dirt and debris flying into the air. We were no longer waiting. Whatever was coming from the depths had arrived. The air in the dugout felt thicker now, as if the walls themselves were closing in on us. The tremors had stopped, but the oppressive silence that followed only seemed to magnify the tension. We stood in uneasy stillness, the only sounds our breathing and the soft rustle of equipment being shifted. But the feeling of being watched, of something lurking just beyond the fog, remained. It wasn't long before the panic started to spread. It began with a shout from one of the men on watch. We rushed to the entrance of the dugout, weapons drawn, unsure of what we were about to face. The shouting was frantic, then quieted abruptly. All that remained was the eerie hum of the fog, pressing in like a weight. I was the first to step outside, my boots sinking slightly into the mud as I moved toward the source of the disturbance. The others followed close behind, but the closer we got, the more I felt something was wrong. No soldiers should be acting this way, not like this. As we rounded the corner of the trench, we saw him. A guardsman, one of ours, was standing near the edge of the trench. His back was turned to us, but the odd way he stood, rigid, unmoving, almost as if he were frozen in place, immediately set me on edge. He wasn't responding to the calls from his comrades, nor did he seem to notice the growing crowd forming behind us. "Albin!" Miri called out, her voice loud, cutting through the thick air. "Albin, you hear me?" No response. I moved closer, my heart thumping in my chest. The fog parted around the soldier, and that's when I saw it. His skin was pale, almost sickly white, and slick with sweat. His eyes were open, but they didn't focus on anything. They were wild, unfocused, flickering around in a way that made my stomach turn. "Albin," I said again, now standing only a few feet away from him. "What the hell is going on with you?" He didn't move. His chest rose and fell with heavy breaths, but they were ragged, uneven. His mouth hung open, a thin string of drool dripping from the corner of his lips. It looked like he was about to speak, but then, without warning, his hands shot up in front of his face, claws extending from the tips of his fingers. "Emperor, what the hell?" Thale muttered from behind me. I staggered back, barely able to keep my balance. My mind was racing, but none of the pieces were fitting together. Albin's body was changing, distorting in front of us. The fingers on his hands seemed to lengthen unnaturally, his skin turning a sickly shade of green. His whole body began to twitch, spasms jerking through his limbs like they were being controlled by something outside his will. "Get back!" Miri shouted, pulling me away from him, but it was too late. Albin's body jerked violently, his spine cracking as he hunched forward, his head lolling back to reveal the grotesque transformation that was taking place. His teeth, once normal, had turned into jagged, serrated points, and his eyes, those eyes, were no longer human. They were burning with the kind of malice I had only seen in the darkest corners of the galaxy. I saw the moment he finally snapped, his body no longer his own. His mouth opened wide, emitting a low growl that rumbled through the trench like the howl of some terrible beast. Without warning, he lunged at the nearest soldier, his hands raking through the air. "Move!" Thale shouted. The soldier, barely managing to avoid the attack, scrambled back, knocking over crates and spilling rations across the floor in the chaos. I lifted my laser gun, firing a quick reflexive shot into the air. "Get down now!" I yelled, but it was already too late. Albin, no longer the man we had once known, was on top of the soldier in an instant, his mutated form slashing wildly at his exposed neck. Blood sprayed in all directions as the soldier's screams were abruptly silenced. Albin's body hunched over the fallen man, feeding, his jaws tearing into flesh with an inhuman ferocity. I turned away, unable to watch. The stench of blood and bile filled my nostrils as panic spread like wildfire. Men shouted, weapons clattering against the trench's walls as they scrambled to respond. "Corvin, we need to move," Miri shouted, grabbing my arm and pulling me back toward the dugout. "We need to quarantine him before..." Before she could finish, the earth beneath us shuddered again and a loud crack echoed through the trench. The ground began to tremble as Albin's former comrades, now twisted and howling like animals, charged at us from the fog. We were already retreating into the safety of the dugout, but the chaos was spreading fast. "Get the medical supplies!" Thale barked, his voice commanding despite the chaos. "We need to stop this before it gets worse. Miri, get to the communications station. We need to contact command." I slammed the door behind us, heart hammering. I turned to Thale. "This isn't just an infection, is it? This is something else, something worse." "No," Thale answered, his face grim. "This is the warp. It's here." The quarantine zones went up almost immediately. The guardsmen were hastily setting up barricades, the entire trench becoming a madhouse of fear and confusion. Each infected person was quickly isolated, and any who showed even the slightest sign of the virus were immediately restrained. But it wasn't enough. The disease, if it could even be called that, spread rapidly, infecting the wounded, the civilians, and even some of the soldiers who had been closest to the initial outbreak. The virus's effects were insidious. What started as a cough, a momentary fever, quickly spiraled into something far worse. Mutations, madness, violent aggression. I had seen it in Albin's eyes, and I feared it was just the beginning. And that's when they arrived. The Inquisitor. He was a tall man, cloaked in dark robes that barely made a sound as he walked. His eyes, cold and piercing, swept across the trench, taking in every detail with disturbing precision. "I am Inquisitor Hellion," he said, his voice sharp and commanding, "and I've been sent to investigate this situation. The Emperor has made his will known. You will follow my orders, and you will keep quiet about what you've seen. Is that understood?" None of us said anything, but we all nodded. There was something in his presence that demanded respect, or perhaps more accurately, fear. "We're dealing with chaos," Inquisitor Hellion continued, as though speaking to himself. "This virus is not a plague, but a tool, and it's being used to break your world apart. We need to find its source, and we need to destroy it before this planet falls completely." We had no choice but to follow. As he walked past us, his gaze lingered on me for just a moment, the weight of it pressing down on my chest. I didn't understand what he saw in me, but I had a feeling that whatever was coming next, I wouldn't be prepared for it. The planet was already changing, and we were just beginning to understand how deep the warp's corruption had run. It's strange how quickly everything can shatter. A week ago, the planet was still a place with hope, with purpose, even if it was grim and distant. Now, we were just trying to survive, and that feeling of a slow, creeping death was sinking into every crevice of this cursed trench. It started slowly, like all things do, small outbreaks in the southern sectors, reports of men getting sick, of civilians becoming twisted. But then the signs were everywhere. Infected soldiers, some of them, I was told, even from my own unit, began to show the same symptoms: erratic behavior, fever, violent tremors, and a twisted, unnatural hunger. But that was nothing compared to what came next. I stood at the edge of the trench, staring out into the thick fog, trying to keep my mind from spiraling. The air had never felt so suffocating, and the constant tension gnawed at my nerves. We were on edge, watching for something we couldn't see, something we didn't understand. "They're pulling us back, Corvin," Miri said, her voice low, hesitant. I turned to her, though I knew what she was talking about. They were starting to pull the soldiers from key sectors, including us. We weren't prepared for what was coming, but we were being given orders. Orders to contain the outbreaks, to quarantine areas, and to make sure it didn't spread further. "Contain," I muttered, the word tasting bitter on my tongue. "Contain what exactly?" Miri's eyes darkened. "The infection." "I don't think we're dealing with an infection anymore," I replied, gripping my laser gun tightly. "This isn't just some plague. This is something worse." The fog in the trench seemed to grow thicker, heavier, as though the atmosphere itself was pressing down on us. I felt the weight of it in my chest, suffocating me slowly. The men who had been assigned to the south weren't coming back, and we all knew it. The first serious encounter came just before dawn. We were assigned to sweep a civilian district, a rundown area of crumbling buildings, once bustling with life, now abandoned and choked with the stench of rot. It was nothing more than a shell of what it had been before the war. The infection had reached here long before we did. As we moved through the rubble, I saw the signs: burned out husks of buildings, blood-stained streets, and the unmistakable stench of decay. Then we found them. A group of civilians, if they could still be called that, emerged from the darkness. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, their eyes wide and unblinking. Their skin was an unhealthy pallor, slick and stretched tight over their bones. Their clothes were torn and shredded, as though they had been in some kind of struggle. And their faces, they weren't human anymore. They had twisted into something monstrous. Their mouths were stretched into grins that didn't belong on human faces, their teeth elongated and jagged, and their eyes were filled with madness, something primal, feral. Before we could react, they lunged. I don't remember how it started or what the first soldier yelled, but chaos erupted in an instant. A woman, if she was even a woman anymore, rushed toward us, her hands clawing at the air. One of our men shot her, but the bolt didn't stop her. She fell to the ground, but got back up almost immediately, faster than before, her body twitching as if it were being controlled by something far more powerful than the will of any mortal. "Don't let them get close," Miri shouted, firing her laser gun at another of the creatures. The blast caught it in the shoulder, sending it sprawling, but it scrambled back to its feet with terrifying speed. The stench hit me then, the sharp, acrid smell of bile and decay, mixed with something far worse, like the very air was suffused with the essence of the warp. I could feel it on my skin, like the infection itself was crawling under it, urging me to give in. But this wasn't just a plague, this was something else entirely. I had seen men die in battle. I had seen the effects of chemical warfare, but this was different. These weren't just sick civilians or infected soldiers, they were something more. I fired into the nearest figure, a man who had once been a merchant perhaps, or a farmer, his body now contorted into something unrecognizable. My shot took him in the chest, but it didn't slow him down. He kept coming, and as he came closer, I saw the distorted symbol carved into his arm, a mark I recognized all too well, the mark of chaos. "Move! Move!" Thale's voice cut through the chaos. I barely heard him over the roar of gunfire, the screeching of the creatures, and the unholy growl that seemed to emanate from every corner of the battlefield. We fell back, regrouping at the edge of the district, our weapons raised. But the creatures kept coming, relentless and driven by something I couldn't comprehend. This wasn't just an infection, it was an infestation, a virus, a corruption that had taken root in the very fabric of the planet. I watched as Thale took down another infected civilian with a single shot, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. He knew, we all knew. "This is no plague," I said, barely above a whisper. "This is the warp, it's here." Thale didn't answer. He didn't need to. Later that day, we were briefed by the officers. The quarantine zones had been expanded. Civilians were being pulled from the streets, herded into holding camps, though we knew it was only a matter of time before they, too, would fall victim to whatever infection was spreading across the planet. Some of the military units were retreating, but there were too many hotspots, too many breaches. Inquisitor Hellion arrived shortly after, his presence like a dark cloud over the entire operation. His cold, calculating gaze swept over the soldiers, the civilians, and then settled on me for just a moment, as if he could see right through me. "I've come to assess the situation," he said, his voice sharp, giving no room for questioning. "The Emperor's will must be carried out, and this infection is the work of chaos. It is my responsibility to find the source, and you are to assist me in that mission." I could feel the weight of his gaze on me, the heaviness of the responsibility he had just placed on my shoulders. The very air seemed to vibrate with the power of his words. It was clear to me then this wasn't just a virus. It wasn't just some new strain of plague. This was the beginning of something far worse, something that could tear the Imperium apart from within. "We have no time to waste," Inquisitor Hellion continued, his tone final. "This world will either fall or we will cleanse it, but we must act quickly." As I turned to follow him, the sickening realization hit me like a slap in the face. This was no ordinary plague. This was chaos, and it was already too late to stop it. The trench had never felt so empty. Even though we were surrounded by the remnants of war, the whispers of soldiers' voices had grown silent. The walls of the trench loomed like the bones of a dead god, and the ever-present fog was thick with the weight of something we couldn't see, something we didn't understand. That was the worst part, I think, the not knowing. I had come to the bleak realization that this wasn't just a disease, a plague, or even a chaos infection anymore. It was something else, something deeper, something that reached into our minds and twisted them, gnawing away at the very edges of our sanity. I hadn't told anyone, but I had started seeing things, flashing images, faces of men I'd known, some of them dead, some of them still here, grinning at me from the corners of my vision. Sometimes I thought I heard whispers in the fog, voices calling my name, but when I turned there was never anyone there. And then there were the dreams. Dark dreams that felt more like memories. Dreams of twisted, inhuman shapes, clawing hands reaching out from the void, and an endless hollow laugh that seemed to come from the very depths of the earth. When I woke up, I felt something cold in my chest, like the presence of something watching me, waiting for the right moment to strike. Today, I learned just how close that moment really was. We were tasked with clearing an old supply depot, an abandoned facility just outside the outskirts of the trench lines. It had been left untouched by the enemy for weeks, and now it was our responsibility to secure it. At least that's what we were told, but I could already feel it, the sense that something was wrong. The air was thick with dread, heavier than it had ever been. The fog hung close to the ground, and the usual distant sounds of artillery had fallen quiet. The only sound now was the muffled crunch of our boots against the wet, mud-filled earth. Thale's voice cracked over the comms. "Stay sharp. We've got a breach ahead. Keep it tight." We moved forward, rifles raised, our eyes scanning the ruins ahead. The building was a gutted skeleton of metal and concrete, crumpled into itself like an old can left to rust in the rain. No movement, no sign of life, nothing. Then I heard it. A low rumbling, almost like the sound of the earth itself groaning, followed by a screech that sent a chill through my bones. The fog parted for a moment, and in the distance, I saw it. At first I thought it was a mirage, a trick of the light, but it wasn't. It was real. A figure emerged from the shadows of the depot, hunched and twisted, its limbs too long and its body too thin. It was humanoid in shape, but the eyes, those eyes, burned with a sickly green light, as though they were drawn from the very essence of the warp. Its mouth hung open, and though it had no tongue, I could hear it whispering. It was calling to us. I staggered back, my rifle raised instinctively, but my hands shook too violently to get a steady shot. It was as though the very air around us was suffused with something dark, pulling at the edges of my mind, and I couldn't focus. I could barely breathe. "Open fire!" Thale shouted, his voice cutting through the fog. "Don't let it get close." We all fired. A dozen shots rang out in unison, hitting the creature in a burst of light and sound. But it didn't stop. The rounds bounced off its skin like pebbles hitting stone, and it simply tilted its head to one side, as if confused by the attack. And then it spoke. "Come closer," it whispered, its voice low and reverberating in my skull, like it was coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. "I see you." I froze, my blood running cold. The creature took another step forward, its legs contorting unnaturally, as though the bones themselves had twisted and broken inside its body. And then, in one fluid motion, it leapt. The impact sent me crashing into the ground, my breath knocked out of me as it landed on top of me. Its cold, clammy skin pressed against mine, and I could feel the essence of the warp flooding through my veins. My head swam, and for a moment I thought I was going to lose consciousness. But then I saw it. I saw what it truly was. The demon's eyes weren't just burning with green light. They were filled with the faces of those I had lost, of soldiers I had known, of men I had fought beside, and even the civilians who had fallen prey to the infection. They were all there, staring at me, their expressions twisted in agony and fear. And they were screaming for help. I screamed too, but it didn't matter. The demon's grip tightened around my throat and my vision blurred. "Corvin!" Miri's voice cut through the haze. "Corvin!" She was there, a flash of movement pulling the demon off of me with one swift motion. Her laser gun cracked, hitting the creature square in the chest. The blast sent it stumbling backward, but it didn't fall. It just stood there, staring at us with that unholy gaze, its form flickering in and out like it was fading in and out of reality. Thale grabbed me, pulling me to my feet. "Move! Now!" We retreated back toward the safety of the trenches, but the demon didn't follow. It just stood there, watching us with those glowing eyes, the whispers still echoing in my mind. Later, back in the trench, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Not just with the world around us, but with my own mind. I had seen it, hadn't I? The demon, the faces, or had I imagined it all? I wasn't sure anymore. The men in our unit weren't faring much better. In the aftermath of the encounter, several of them reported hearing voices in the fog, seeing things that weren't there. Some claimed they'd seen faces in the smoke. Others swore they had felt cold hands gripping their shoulders in the dark. We were all starting to unravel. "What's happening to us?" I asked Thale later, my voice barely above a whisper. "I'm not sure I can trust my own mind anymore." Thaler didn't answer right away. He simply stared into the fog, his expression drawn tight. Finally, he spoke. I think it's the warp. The infection is just a doorway, Corvin, a way for them to get inside." "Who?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "The demons, the chaos gods." "Not just them," Thale said quietly. "It's the nature of the warp itself. The infection is like a conduit, a way for them to slip through into our world. And now, it's starting to take us with it." The tension in the trenches had escalated over the past few days, and it wasn't just the fog that had become thicker, it was the weight of fear of something insidious growing in the dark corners of our minds. We could feel it in every breath, like the planet itself was watching us, waiting for us to crack. The squad had moved deeper into the ruined sectors of the city, following orders to clear out any remaining pockets of resistance. But we weren't dealing with the usual chaos of a battlefield. We weren't facing heretics or rebels. We were facing something far more dangerous, something that wore the faces of our comrades. It started with the whispers. At first, we thought it was just another symptom of the virus, paranoia, sickness playing tricks on us. But then, one of the infected spoke. I had to see it for myself. The man we found was in a dilapidated church of all places, its walls defaced with symbols I didn't recognize. Strange markings, twisted and unnatural, scrawled across every surface. In the center of the room, a group of the infected were gathered in a circle, chanting in low, guttural voices. I couldn't understand their words, but the tone was unmistakable. Reverence, madness, worship. We'd already put down a few of the infected, but this was different. "Stay low," Thale muttered, his voice barely a whisper, his hand on his laser gun. "We can't risk letting them know we're here." I nodded, heart pounding in my chest as we crouched behind the ruins of a collapsed pillar, trying to make out the figures in the church. The infected didn't look like soldiers anymore. They were kneeling, heads bowed, their hands raised to the dark altar at the center of the room. And the altar, it wasn't some piece of military equipment or relic from before the war. No, this was something else. The stone was twisted, covered in blood, fresh blood, and there were more symbols that burned in my mind as I stared at them. I'd seen them before, but I couldn't remember where. The infection had spread beyond just physical changes. They were worshipping, they were praising something, someone, the warp itself. "Corvin," Miri whispered, her eyes wide with disbelief. Is that a chaos ritual?" I didn't answer. I didn't need to. We both knew what it meant. Thale moved in the moment we saw the cultists, his face a mask of grim determination. He signaled us forward, but not before one of the infected turned, its eyes locking onto us for just a second. There was a flash of recognition, then the demon's gleam in its eyes. "We've been made," I muttered under my breath. The infected didn't just react, they rose with unnatural speed, their eyes glowing with that sickly green light that had burned through the fog when we first encountered them, and their faces, twisted, contorted, as though they had been remade into something else. The chanting grew louder, the air crackled with the charge of something malevolent. "Open fire!" Thale shouted. The world exploded. Laser gun fire lit up the room in bright, violent flashes. I aimed and fired, my rifle punching out a stream of red bolts that cut through the air and hit the cultists. But the shots did little to slow them down. They screamed in fury as they surged toward us, moving faster than they had any right to. "Stay together," Miri screamed, firing back into the crowd of cultists as they rushed at us. I couldn't focus. My heart was in my throat, pounding with fear, as the figures of men I had once known twisted into something unrecognizable. something twisted and wrong. Their mouths were open in a horrible grin, but there was nothing human in their eyes. "Corvin!" Thales' voice sliced through my panic. "We need to fall back to the perimeter, now!" But there was no time. One of the cultists, a man I once knew as Sergeant Doss, lunged at me with a brutal scream, his hands twisting into claws that dug deep into my shoulder. My rifle was knocked away, and I could feel his breath on my skin as he pulled me toward the ground. A burst of lasgun fire ripped through the air, and Doss was thrown back, blood splattering across the stone floor. I scrambled to my feet, my vision spinning, and saw Miri standing over me, her rifle still smoking in her hands. "Get moving!" she shouted, her face taut with desperation. We retreated, fighting our way through the collapsing church, firing into the throng of cultists as they surged forward, their chants growing louder, more unhinged with every passing second. "We need to clear this area," Thales said through gritted teeth. "Now!" We reached the exit, and just as we did, a loud explosion rang out from the rear of the building. The sound of it echoed like a death knell, a sharp, punishing reminder of how much we had failed. "Retreat to the barricades," Thale ordered, his voice shaking with barely controlled fury. "Now! Move!" But we were too late. The infected soldiers, the ones we'd thought we had contained, were already breaking through the perimeter. The local militia, those few survivors who still held some semblance of order, were scattering, their guns firing wildly into the madness. Some of them, I realized with a sickening lurch in my stomach, had already joined the cult. They had crossed the line. They had defected. I watched, paralyzed, as one of the militia soldiers, Lance, a man I had once trained with, aimed his rifle at one of his own comrades, his face twisted with hatred. "Lance, stop!" I shouted, but it was too late. The shot rang out, a crack of red light. The soldier he had shot fell, lifeless to the ground. "What are you doing?" I shouted, stepping toward him, but Lance didn't flinch. He turned to me, his eyes wide with manic excitement, filled with that same green glow I had seen in the infected. "They don't understand," he whispered, his voice distant, hollow. "The Emperor's blind. We have seen the truth. The warp. It is power." Before I could react, another of the militia soldiers, his face contorted in panic, turned his weapon on Lance. A shot rang out, and Lance dropped to the ground, but the other man didn't seem relieved. "We've lost it," he muttered, his voice breaking. It was true, we had. The militia was falling apart, its soldiers turning on each other, some joining the chaos cultists, others too terrified to fight back. I had seen it all before, the way the infection twisted and corrupted, but this was more than just madness. This was heresy, pure and unadulterated. This was the warp, wearing the skin of men. I fought back the rising panic in my chest. We couldn't let them win. We couldn't let the darkness take everything we had left. "Fall back!" Thale shouted, pulling me from my thoughts. "We need to regroup. This fight is lost." I didn't argue. We ran, pushing through the chaos, our steps pounding on the dirt and stone. I looked back once, my chest tight, my heart heavy with the weight of what we had just witnessed. I couldn't shake the image of Lance's face, the face of a man I had once known, now twisted in the image of something far worse. And in the distance, the chanting still echoed. The fog outside had thickened, as if the very air itself had become poisoned by the chaos lurking in every corner of this forsaken planet. We moved through the darkened streets, now more like haunted ruins than anything else. Once proud buildings now lay in ruin, shattered windows staring like empty eyes. There was no sound, save the occasional screech of metal as the wind picked up the forgotten remnants of battle. We'd long stopped trying to make sense of the desolation. I wasn't sure how much longer I could take this. The infection had spread faster than anyone had anticipated, and now we were tasked with a mission far more terrifying than the simple act of survival. Command had issued orders to find the source of this madness, to track down whatever caused this contagion. The rumors had led us here, an old cathedral deep within the heart of the city, a place abandoned long ago, left to rot in the shadows of time. I could feel it in my gut that this was the beginning of the end. "Keep it tight," Thal ordered, his voice steady, but there was something underneath it, a flicker of doubt. I saw it in his eyes as we trudged through the city. We don't know what we'll find in there, but it's our job to make sure we stop it. Miri moved silently at the rear of the group, her eyes darting from side to side, watching for anything out of place. Her posture was rigid, but I could see her hands trembling slightly, a nervousness she couldn't fully suppress. "I don't like this, Corvin," she muttered under her breath as I approached her. "Too many things feel wrong." "Tell me about it," I replied, my voice quieter than usual. "But we don't have much choice. If we don't go in, this entire city's going to fall." Miri didn't answer. Instead, she just nodded grimly. I couldn't blame her for her hesitation. There was no rational explanation for why we were going deeper into this madness. But there was one certainty in my mind. The longer we waited, the more our chances of survival slipped away. We reached the cathedral just before dusk, its spires jutting into the sky like twisted fingers, as if to claw their way back to whatever hellish dimension they had been born from. The stone walls were covered in a sickly green moss, and the front doors, once grand and proud, hung ajar, cracked wide enough for a man to slip through. The smell hit us first, stale, rotting air that clung to the inside of the building like an old, forgotten wound. As we stepped through the doors, I felt a strange pressure build in my chest, as if the weight of this forsaken place was bearing down on us. The darkness inside was nearly absolute, save for the flickering of our lanterns and the dim, distant light filtering through cracked, stained glass windows. "Move in," Thale ordered, his voice stern but tinged with something that sounded like fear. We weren't supposed to be afraid. We were soldiers, but no soldier could look at this place and not feel it. This cathedral was no mere ruin. It was a tomb, a monument to something dark. The walls were covered in symbols, twisted, intricate designs that looked both alien and familiar at the same time. They pulsed with an unnatural energy, like the ground itself was alive beneath us. The further we ventured into the cathedral, the more overwhelming the presence of these symbols became. And then we saw it. The altar at the far end of the cathedral was nothing short of horrific. It was massive, made from jagged stone, slick with the remnants of blood that still hadn't dried. The air around it was thick, almost suffocating, and I could feel the oppressive weight of the warp pressing down on me with every step I took. But it wasn't just the altar, it was what lay beside it that caught my eye. A pile of dismembered bodies, humans, or what had once been human, lay in a heap at the foot of the altar. Their flesh was rotting, their eyes hollowed out, their limbs twisted in impossible angles. I fought the bile rising in my throat as I turned away. Miri's voice trembled as she spoke. This is a ritual. They've been sacrificing people." I stepped forward, my boots crunching on the stone floor. The bloodstains in front of the altar weren't just signs of sacrifice, they were deliberate. The symbols carved into the altar itself matched those that had been scrawled on the walls of the cathedral. It was a dark, ancient language, older than anything I had ever seen. A language born from the darkest corners of the warp. "Chaos," I muttered under my breath. I could feel the weight of the word in my chest. They've been using the people as sacrifices for the gods. I reached out instinctively, my hand brushing against one of the stone symbols carved into the altar. It was warm, unnaturally so, as though the altar itself was alive. "Get away from that," Thal warned, his voice low and strained. "Don't touch it." But it was too late. The moment my fingers made contact with the stone, the air seemed to crackle, as if the very fabric of reality was being torn. The ground shook beneath us, and a low, guttural growl echoed from the depths of the cathedral. A flicker of movement caught my eye, and I looked up in time to see a massive shadow blot out the light from our lanterns. The shape was enormous, its form indistinct, but its presence undeniable. It was a creature of the warp, a demon, but not like any I had seen before. Its body rippled and shifted as though it was made of the very air itself, twisting and reshaping like something out of a nightmare. And then, with a roar that shook the very foundation of the cathedral, it lunged at us. I barely had time to raise my rifle before the demon was on us, its massive clawed hand slashing through the air with terrifying speed. Thale fired first, his lasergun's bright bolts tearing into the creature's form, but they seemed to have little effect. "Fall back!" Thale shouted, but his voice was drowned out by the sound of the creature's massive form crashing through the pews, sending chunks of stone and wood flying in all directions. We turned and ran, my legs moving faster than I thought possible, my heart hammering in my chest. The air around us seemed to warp, the edges of my vision blurring as though the very space around us was distorting. I could hear the demon's roar echoing behind us, and I knew we wouldn't make it out unless we acted fast. The cathedral's walls seemed to pulse with the energy of the warp, like the building itself was alive. It was trying to trap us. It was feeding off of us. We made it back to the main doors just as the demon's claws raked the air behind us, sending a shower of stone and debris into the fog. I didn't look back. We stumbled out into the cold air, panting, our breaths visible in the chill. I could still feel the demon's presence pressing in on me, its influence lingering like a shadow in the corner of my mind. "We need to report this," Thale said, his voice hollow. He looked like he was about to say more, but then he stopped. His eyes seemed distant, as if the weight of what we had just witnessed had crushed something inside him. "We need to get out of here," Miri whispered, her voice shaking. This place is cursed." As we made our way back to the trench, I couldn't shake the feeling that we had stepped into something much darker than we could have ever imagined. The infection wasn't just a virus, it was a doorway, a portal, pulling us into the heart of madness, and it was only just beginning. The trenches were eerily quiet, even as the chaos of the battle outside seemed to press closer. The steady hum of artillery was like a distant memory now, muffled by the ever-present fog that clung to the earth, suffocating the very air we breathed. In the silence, I could feel something stirring, something that didn't belong to this world. It crept into my thoughts like an unwelcome guest, burrowing deep into the darkest corners of my mind. It had started subtly at first, a whisper barely audible above the clamor of our hurried footsteps. I thought it was the wind, or perhaps a trick of the mind. But as the days wore on, the whispering became clearer, more insistent, until it was all I could hear. The first time it spoke my name, I thought I was imagining things. I had been alone in the trenches just after dusk when the voice came. "Corvin." I froze. For a moment, I stood still, my heart pounding in my chest. The voice was soft, almost loving in its tone, but there was something unnatural about it, the way it lingered in the air like a shadow you couldn't escape. "Corvin, come closer." I turned, scanning the empty trench, but there was nothing there, only the haze of fog swirling around the edges of my vision. My grip on my rifle tightened as I tried to shake the feeling of unease crawling under my skin. But then, the whisper came again, this time closer. "Come, to the dark." I shuddered, the hair on the back of my neck standing up. My legs felt weak, like the ground beneath me was shifting. I swallowed hard, fighting the panic that rose in my chest. "Stay calm," I muttered to myself. "It's just the stress, it's nothing." But deep down, I knew that it wasn't nothing. Back at our shelter, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. My eyes darted around the room, but all I could see were my comrades, equally exhausted, their faces drawn with fear and fatigue. The tension between us had been growing ever since we returned from the cathedral. It wasn't just the threat of the infection anymore. It was something else. Something far darker, far deeper. Miri was staring at her hands, her eyes distant, lost in thought. Thaler's jaw was clenched, and I could see his fingers twitching, as if ready to draw his weapon at the slightest provocation. Even the most hardened soldiers in our unit were starting to unravel. "What's wrong with them?" Miri asked suddenly, her voice barely above a whisper. I followed her gaze to the corner of the dugout where a group of soldiers huddled together. They were whispering to each other, their faces pale and drawn, their eyes hollow. One of them, a man named Kessler, had been acting strange ever since we came back from the cathedral. His movements were stiff, jerky, and he often muttered to himself, words that made no sense. "They're not the same," Miri said, her voice shaking. It's like they're changing." I watched Kessler carefully as he turned to look at me, and for a moment, his eyes locked onto mine with an intensity that made my stomach twist. Then he smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was something twisted, something that didn't belong on a human face. We were snapped out of our unease by the sound of a distant explosion. The ground trembled beneath our feet, and I heard the familiar hum of battle in the distance. But this time, it was different. This wasn't an isolated skirmish. It was the beginning of something far worse. "Get your gear," Thaler shouted, pulling me from my thoughts. "We've got a breach. There's movement on the perimeter." The panic was immediate. We scrambled to our feet, readying our weapons, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. There was an unnatural energy in the air, a coldness that seemed to radiate from the very ground we stood on. As we moved toward the front lines, the fog thickened, swirling around us like an oppressive blanket. The whispers were louder now, clearer. "Corvin!" I clenched my teeth, trying to ignore it. This wasn't real. It couldn't be. But it was real, and I was hearing it. "Come to me, Corvin. I am waiting." My heart skipped a beat as the whisper echoed louder in my mind. Something was calling me. The warp was calling me. The battlefront was chaos, but not the kind I had grown used to. The usual soldiers we faced, the rebels and heretics, had been replaced by something far worse. These weren't just human enemies anymore. They were corrupted, mutated, twisted by the very forces of chaos. The first creature I saw was barely human. Its body was deformed, its limbs too long and gnarled, its skin stretched taut over its bones, as if it had been torn from reality itself. Its eyes were hollow black pits, and its mouth was stretched wide in a grotesque grin. It screeched as it lunged at one of our men, claws raking through his armor, tearing him apart in an instant. "Fire!" Thale ordered, his voice tight with fear. We fired in unison, but the creature barely flinched. It was like trying to kill smoke. It shifted, twisting in and out of our sights, moving faster than anything should. And then there were more. From the fog, they came, hulking monstrosities, their bodies shifting and distorting in ways that defied nature. Each one was a grotesque parody of the human form, a demon made flesh. They clawed their way toward us, their eyes gleaming with the same unnatural green light that had burned in the eyes of the infected soldiers we'd seen earlier. I fired into the nearest one, but the beam of my laser gun only seemed to scatter against its form, like the energy was absorbed by something darker, something that shouldn't exist. "Retreat!" Thale shouted, grabbing my arm and pulling me back. "We need to fall back now." We were outnumbered, outmatched, and as the demon creatures closed in, the panic began to spread like wildfire. Soldiers were turning and running, their fear fueling the chaos, and I could see the terror in their eyes as they tried to flee from the monstrosities that were closing in around us. But I couldn't move. The whisper came again, this time in a voice that made my blood run cold. "Corvin, come to me. You cannot escape." My hands trembled as I raised my weapon again, but the fight seemed pointless. It wasn't the demons we were fighting. It was something far worse. I could feel the corruption spreading inside me like a parasite gnawing at my mind. I could hear the call, feel the presence of something watching me, something waiting for me to surrender. "Come to the dark, Corvin. Embrace the truth. Embrace the warp." The words echoed in my skull, and for a brief moment, I almost felt the pull. Then something snapped inside me. I fired into the nearest demon, and this time, it went down. The shot tore through its chest, and for a moment it collapsed into a heap of blackened flesh and bone. The others hesitated, and I took the opportunity to back away, pulling the others with me. But as we retreated, I knew one thing for certain. I had heard the call of the warp, and I knew it wouldn't be the last time. The planet was dying, slowly, relentlessly. The air, thick with the scent of decay and smoke, carried the whispers of something far more sinister than any virus or plague could ever be. The infection had spread across the land, into the cities, the fields, and the very soil beneath our boots. It wasn't just a disease anymore. It was an invasion, an infestation of the soul itself. The virus hadn't just twisted the civilians or infected the soldiers. It had driven them mad, reshaped their minds, and turned them into something unrecognizable. Worse than animals, worse than heretics. It was as though the warp itself had taken root in their hearts, feeding off their fears, their weaknesses, their despair. And now we were being sent to the heart of it. A key city, one of the last bastions of Imperial order, had fallen. What had once been a thriving metropolis now stood as a breeding ground for chaos, a place where the infection had mutated into something far darker than any of us could have imagined. We arrived at the city's outskirts just as the sun dipped beneath the horizon, its faint glow casting a red hue over the skyline. The city, once an industrial hub, was now a maze of crumbling buildings, fire-scorched streets, and abandoned vehicles. The air was thick with ash, the ground slick with mud, and there was a strange, unsettling quiet that hung over everything. Not even the distant sound of artillery could penetrate the stillness. I glanced over at Thaler, his jaw clenched tight, his eyes scanning the horizon. "So, this is it," I said, though I already knew the answer. "The city of the damned." Thaler didn't respond. Instead, he motioned for the squad to move forward, and we began our trek into the heart of the city. We moved cautiously, our weapons at the ready, but there was nothing to fight. Not yet. The first sign that something was wrong came when we entered the city's central square. A once bustling marketplace, now reduced to rubble, was littered with bodies. Some were clearly soldiers, their faces twisted in expressions of fear and agony. Others were civilians, their clothes torn, their bodies mutilated beyond recognition. But there was something worse, something that made my stomach turn. The dead weren't just dead. Some of them were still twitching. Their eyes, still open, darted from side to side, and I could hear faint murmurs escaping their lips, though no one was alive to speak them. "What the hell?" Miri whispered, her voice filled with dread. "How can they still be moving?" "They're not moving," I replied, my voice tight. "The infections, it's doing something to them. It's not just taking their bodies, it's changing them." As we advanced deeper into the city, the signs of corruption became more apparent. Strange, twisting symbols had been carved into walls, doors, and the very ground itself. Dark rituals had taken place here, ceremonies that had twisted the once pure soul of this city into something unholy. We passed through the shattered remains of what had once been a grand cathedral, its stained glass windows shattered, its holy symbols desecrated. The air was thick with the scent of burnt incense and decay, a strange cloying odor that seemed to seep into our bones. And that's when I heard it again, the whisper, "Corvin, come closer." I stopped in my tracks, the blood draining from my face as the voice echoed in my mind. My heartbeat quickened and I glanced around trying to locate the source. But it wasn't real, was it? This had to be a hallucination. A side effect of the stress, the fear, the madness that had been creeping in since we first set foot on this cursed world. But the voice wasn't just in my head. I could hear it in the air, soft and insistent, like a dark presence that had always been with me, waiting for the right moment to strike. "Corvin, don't..." Miri's voice broke through my thoughts. "Don't listen to it." I turned to face her, and I saw the fear in her eyes. Fear of something far worse than the infection, something that was eating away at all of us, fear that we were already lost. The next few hours blurred by in a haze of confusion and dread. We moved deeper into the city, but it felt like we were walking in circles. The buildings seemed to close in around us, the streets narrower and more claustrophobic. There was something wrong with the very air, something that made it hard to breathe, like a weight pressing down on our chests. And then we found them. A group of soldiers, our own men, had set up barricades in one of the city's many alleyways. They looked wrong. Their uniforms were torn, their faces gaunt and hollow-eyed, and there was a strange, unsettling silence to their movements. "Corvin," one of them called to me, his voice hollow. "We've been waiting for you." I felt my blood run cold. It was Kessler. The same Kessler I'd seen back in the trenches. But now he was different. His eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and there was a twisted smile on his face that didn't belong to him. "Stay back," Thale ordered, his voice harsh. "What happened to you, Kessler?" "They don't understand," Kessler replied, his voice distant, as if someone else was speaking through him. "The warp is power, Corvin. It is the future. Join us, and you will see. We can make it all stop. The Emperor is blind. We are the chosen." I felt the pull again, the whisper, the call of the warp. It was getting stronger, louder, like a song in the back of my mind, but I couldn't give in. Not yet. "They're lost," I said, stepping forward, my rifle aimed at Kessler. "This is the corruption. You need to fight it, Kessler. This isn't you." But Kessler didn't seem to hear me. He only smiled wider, and then with a low, guttural growl, he lunged at us. The battle was swift and brutal. Our squad fired into the chaos, but it didn't matter. The infected soldiers, no longer our comrades, moved like beasts, their bodies contorted, their minds consumed by the warp. They were no longer human. They were something else entirely. In the chaos, I saw the true depth of the corruption. Miri had been shooting at one of the soldiers when she hesitated, her rifle wavering in her hands. I saw the doubt in her eyes as she hesitated to kill what had once been a comrade. But in that moment of hesitation, one of the soldiers grabbed her, pulling her into the fray. "Miri!" I shouted, but it was too late. She fought back, but I could see the fear in her eyes. She wasn't sure anymore. We weren't sure anymore. We had to finish it. As the last of the infected soldiers fell, silence descended upon the alleyway, but it was not peaceful. The very air felt charged with a strange energy, as though something was watching us, waiting. We stood there, breathing heavily, our weapons still raised, but none of us spoke. The doubt, the fear, it had already started to take root in our minds. We had all seen it now, the corruption, the infection, and it was worse than we could have ever imagined. Kessler's body lay at my feet, his eyes wide open, staring blankly into the sky. I felt a pang of guilt deep in my chest. He was lost, and so were we. "The infection is spreading too fast," Thal said, his voice hoarse. "We can't stop it, we're just part of it now." I didn't argue, I couldn't. We had already failed. As we regrouped, I felt the weight of the whisper again. The warp was still calling to me, and it wasn't just calling me, it was calling us all. I had always believed that soldiers were bound by a common thread, a shared sense of duty, a promise to protect one another no matter the cost. But in these trenches, in the shadow of the warp's corruption, I began to wonder if that thread was as fragile as the lives we were fighting to protect. The whispers had grown louder, more insistent in my mind. It was hard to focus on anything else. Their voices echoed in my thoughts, drowning out everything else. At night, when I tried to sleep, the only thing I heard was the call. It wasn't just the infection anymore. No, this was something far more insidious, creeping into the very fabric of my mind. It wanted me, it wanted all of us. But it wasn't just in my head. I saw it in the others too. Miri had become distant, her eyes haunted, her grip on her lasgun slipping. Thaler had grown colder, more detached, his orders sharper, more authoritative. And then there was Dross, a once trusted comrade who had begun to change in ways that I couldn't explain. I hadn't said anything at first, but it became impossible to ignore. Dross had been acting strange. He'd started muttering to himself in the dark hours of the night, whispering something that sounded like prayers. But they weren't prayers of the Emperor. They were different. I caught him one evening, crouched by the ruined remnants of a chapel, carving strange symbols into the dirt with his knife. When he saw me, he simply smiled, a smile that didn't belong on a man who had once been a brother in arms. "You should listen to the voice, Corvin," he had said, his eyes wide with something I couldn't place. "It's calling you, all of us. It'll show us the way." I had backed away slowly, my heart pounding in my chest. I hadn't said a word to the others, but I knew then that Dross was lost to us. The infection had taken him, mind and soul, but I didn't know what to do. What could we do? He was still one of us, still in the squad, until he wasn't. The next day, the situation escalated. We received orders to secure a weapons cache hidden beneath the ruins of a fortified building on the outskirts of the city. The supplies were vital. Without them, we would be defenseless. And the city, our last foothold in this cursed place, would fall. But as we made our way through the city's crumbling streets, I noticed something unsettling. Dross was gone. He hadn't reported for duty that morning, and no one had seen him since the previous night. I had thought it was just another symptom of his descent, but now I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. "Where's Dross?" I asked, my voice edged with unease. "I haven't seen him," Miri replied, her tone distant, eyes scanning the horizon. "He's not one for morning drills, but this is different." "We'll find him after the mission," Thalie said curtly, his focus elsewhere. "Let's stay sharp, we've got a job to do." I couldn't shake the sense of dread, the feeling that Dross wasn't just lost. He had chosen a side, and it wasn't ours. The weapons cache was hidden deep beneath the city, buried in a network of tunnels that stretched for miles beneath the ruined buildings. The entrance was locked tight, but with the right tools, we were able to breach it and gain entry. Inside, the place was a tomb, dusty, decaying, but filled with weapons, ammunition, and supplies we desperately needed. We were halfway through securing the crates when we heard the first explosion. It was deafening. The ground trembled beneath our feet, and the walls of the tunnel cracked and shifted as if the earth itself was rebelling against us. The lights flickered and the air grew thick with dust. "Get out now!" Thale shouted, his voice panicked as he grabbed my arm. I could barely hear him over the chaos unfolding around us. The walls groaned, and the tunnel seemed to buckle, as though something was pushing back from the other side. The tremors grew worse, and suddenly I saw him, Dross. He stood at the far end of the tunnel, his silhouette framed by the flickering light. His face was twisted with a manic grin, his eyes wide with a fevered, unnatural gleam. "I knew you'd come," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the growing noise. "The warp told me you would." "Dross!" I shouted, trying to move forward, but Thale held me back. "Don't," Thale hissed. "He's not one of us anymore." But it was too late. Dross raised his hand, and the ground around us cracked open, a deep, guttural rumble rising from below. From the chasm that had opened up in the earth, a wave of darkness surged forward. Creatures from the warp, monstrous beings that had once been human, now twisted and deformed beyond recognition. They swarmed toward us, their bodies shifting and slithering in unnatural ways. Their eyes burned with the same green fire I had seen in the infected, and their mouths opened to release horrific, otherworldly screeches. "Dross, no!" I screamed, but he just stood there, his arms outstretched, as though offering himself to the very chaos that had consumed him. His grin widened. "It's too late, Corvin," he said softly, his voice carrying on the winds of madness. "The Emperor doesn't matter. The warp is the truth of power." The ground shook again, and the tunnel started to collapse. We were running now, running from the very thing we had come to secure. Thale pushed us forward, leading us through the darkened halls, but the creatures were closing in. The tunnel was falling apart, the floor cracking beneath our feet, and just as I thought we might escape, the worst happened. An explosion tore through the ceiling above us, sending a massive chunk of rock tumbling down. Thale was knocked off his feet, and the others scattered in panic. I tried to move, but a sharp pain shot through my leg, and I realized I was pinned beneath the rubble. "Thale," I shouted, my voice panicked as the weight of the debris threatened to crush me. "Corvin, stay with me," Thale shouted back, but there was nothing he could do. The tunnel was collapsing too quickly. I heard the unmistakable sound of Dross's voice once more, though it was distant, reverberating through the chaos around us. "It's already over. You'll join us, all of you." And in that moment, I knew. It wasn't just the city that was lost. It was the entire planet. The corruption had already spread too far, and now even the soldiers, our brothers, were lost to it. We barely made it out of the tunnels alive, and what we brought with us, what little was left of our squad, was hardly worth the price we paid. We had lost Dross, we had lost the cache, we had lost the mission. The infection was everywhere, and no matter how hard we fought, the enemy, whether chaos, the warp, or our own minds, was already winning. As we emerged into the open air, I looked around at my squad, my brothers, and realized the truth. The planet's fate was sealed. There was no going back. The walls were barely holding together. What had once been a fortified military outpost on the outskirts of the city had become a prison, a tomb that we were trapped in. The walls, constructed to withstand the relentless assault of artillery, now seemed flimsy, their integrity compromised by the sheer weight of the madness pressing down from all sides. Chaos forces were closing in, and we were running out of time. "We're sitting ducks here," Thale muttered, his hand gripping his laser gun tighter as he scanned the broken windows. The fortified position was more a suggestion of safety than actual protection. The breach in the perimeter walls, the explosion that had nearly taken half the squad, had left us vulnerable. And now, they were coming for us. I couldn't shake the feeling that we were already dead. The whispers had grown louder with each passing hour, echoing in my mind, urging me to surrender, to embrace the inevitable. I fought it, but the longer we stayed here, the harder it became to resist. The first wave had come just after dusk, when the fog rolled in thick and heavy, obscuring everything in sight. Cultists had poured out of the darkness, their eyes glowing with that unnatural green light, their mouths twisted into expressions of pure hatred. They had been led by one of the infected, an officer, one of our own men, now lost to the warp. His face was bloated, his eyes wide with feverish madness. He was shouting something, though none of us could understand it. It didn't matter. All we knew was that he had once been one of us, and now he was leading the charge against us. We fought them off, barely, but as the hours stretched on, the attacks came faster, harder, relentless. They weren't just human anymore. Some of the infected had been twisted into things that defied nature, mutated beasts, once men whose bodies had been altered beyond recognition, their flesh bloated and gnarled. They moved with terrifying speed, their jaws snapping, their claws tearing through the air. There was no rhyme, no reason. They were animals now, monsters, and we were their prey. The second wave was worse because we knew what it was. They were soldiers who had once fought beside us. Now they were no more than shadows, hollowed out shells of what they had been. Their movements were jerky, like marionettes being controlled by unseen strings. They didn't fight with purpose, they fought with rage, and they kept coming. Hours turned into a blur. We had retreated into the inner hall of the outpost, the heavy doors sealed shut behind us. But even that didn't feel safe. The walls groaned as something, or someone, pounded against them from the outside, and I could hear the faint echoes of voices, whispers that cut through the chaos. The warp had infected everything, it seemed. Nothing was safe, nothing was pure. "What the hell do we do now?" Miri's voice was barely audible, but I could hear the edge of panic in it. Her face was pale, her hands shaking as she wiped her brow. "We're not going to make it, are we?" Thala didn't answer immediately. He couldn't. The truth was too hard to face. We were running out of supplies, ammo was low, food was worse, and our bodies were already feeling the strain of constant combat. We had no idea where Dren had gone, no idea if the comms would ever work again. We were alone, and every minute that passed, I could feel the pull of the warp getting stronger, the weight of it pressing down on us, making it harder to breathe. "Damn it," Thale muttered. We fight until we can't anymore." But I could see the doubt in his eyes. He knew what I knew. The end was coming, and we weren't going to win. The attacks grew more frequent, more ferocious. By the third day, the outpost had become a battlefield, the hallway strewn with debris and bodies, ours and theirs. We fought with desperation, firing our weapons into the endless tide of infected soldiers, cultists and monstrosities that came pouring in through every crack and crevice. I tried not to think about it, the feeling that we were surrounded, that there was no way out. But the longer we held out, the more my mind began to unravel. The constant barrage of sound, the growls, the screams, the distant thud of explosions had a maddening effect. It was a noise I could feel, not just hear. And then, on the fourth night, it happened. We were stationed in the main chamber, barricaded behind makeshift walls of crates and scrap metal. The barricade was holding for now, but I knew it was only a matter of time before they broke through. Thale was on watch, his eyes scanning the perimeter. Miri was sitting against the wall, her rifle across her lap. Dren, who had been mute for the last several hours, his face pale and withdrawn, sat by himself in the corner, staring at nothing. That's when I heard it, a whisper, But this wasn't in my head. I turned slowly, my blood freezing as I saw Dren standing, his eyes wide, glowing. The light in his eyes was sickly, an unnatural green that pulsed like some kind of heartbeat. His mouth twisted into a smile. "No," I whispered. "It's time, Corvin." Dren's voice came, but it wasn't Dren's voice. It was something else, something colder, something that didn't belong in his body. You can hear it too, the call. "Come to me. Join us." Miri and Thalie both turned, their expressions filled with disbelief, but the look in Dren's eyes was unmistakable. He had joined them. The infection had taken him. "Don't listen to him," Miri shouted, but the words were drowned out as the room began to shake. The door at the far end of the chamber burst open with a violent crash. The walls trembled as the air thickened with the presence of something terrible, something beyond comprehension. It was them, the creatures from the warp. But this time, they weren't alone. Standing at the entrance to the chamber was something worse, something that radiated power. It was a shape, a shadow. And as it stepped forward, I realized what it was. A demon, a creature of pure evil, shaped from the very stuff of the warp. Its form shifted, like liquid in a glass, constantly changing, constantly warping. But its eyes, they burned with an intensity I couldn't comprehend. Dren stepped forward, moving toward the demon like it was his master, his arms outstretched in worship. "It's too late for you," Dren whispered. "It's too late for all of us." The battle was over before it began. Thale shot first, but the demon was already upon us. A single swipe of its massive claws sent him crashing against the wall, his body crumpling in a heap. Miri fired, but the bolt passed straight through the demon's form as if it wasn't even there. I ran. I had no choice. The walls shook again, and I knew this was the end. The planet was lost. The warp had already claimed it, and us with it. I didn't look back as I ran. I couldn't. I was the last one left. I could hear the whispers, louder now than ever before. "Come to the dark, Corvin. You belong to us now." The fog had always been thick in this place, rolling in from the battlefield and settling over the city like a shroud. It had become more than just a physical presence. It had become a force of its own, a silent spectator to our downfall. The air felt heavier in the fog, charged with something unnatural, something that twisted the very fabric of reality itself. We had retreated into the remnants of the city's old underground tunnels, hoping to find refuge from the chaos that was closing in above ground. But even down here, the darkness seemed to press in, suffocating us. The whispers started the moment we entered, soft at first, just out of reach, like voices lost in the wind. But soon they grew louder, clearer, more insistent. "Corvin, come closer." My name. Always my name. I tried to shake it off, pushing the thought from my mind. The warp had a way of manipulating the senses, playing tricks on the mind. But something inside me told me it was more than that. The whispers weren't just a product of fear or stress. They were something real, something that had taken root in the very air we breathed. We kept moving, but it wasn't the city that haunted me. It wasn't even the creatures or the corrupted soldiers that we had fought before. It was the fog itself, the way it seemed to shift and change around us, like it was alive. I couldn't explain it, but I could feel something moving in the mist. Shapes, figures that were there one moment and gone the next. Flickers in the corner of my eye. I wasn't the only one who felt it. By the time we reached the remnants of an old barricade, abandoned long ago and now overrun by nature, we were all on edge. The fog pressed against our faces, thick and choking, as if the very air itself was trying to smother us. But worse than the fog was the silence. It was too quiet. "Where's Miri?" Thaler's voice broke the stillness, his tone tight with suspicion. We had lost sight of her some time ago. She had been leading the way, but now she was nowhere to be found. "Shit," I muttered, my eyes scanning the darkness around us. "Not again." "Keep your eyes peeled," Thaler ordered. "I'm not taking any chances. Miri, if you're out there, answer me." But there was no response. only the sound of the fog swirling around us. The tension in the group was palpable. Miri had been acting strangely ever since the last battle. She had withdrawn, her eyes distant, her hands trembling. At first, I thought it was just exhaustion, but the further we ventured into the tunnels, the more I began to wonder. Could it be possible? Could Miri, one of the last people I trusted, be succumbing to the same corruption that had claimed so many before her? I took a step forward, my pulse quickening as the fog seemed to close in even tighter. I could hear my breathing, shallow and rapid, in the oppressive silence. My thoughts raced. Was this the warp's doing? Were the whispers I heard real, or were they simply the product of my mind beginning to break under the strain? And then, in the distance, I saw it, a figure standing in the fog. It was barely visible, just a shadow against the shifting mist. I froze, my heart skipping a beat as I stared at it, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. "Corvin, come closer." It was Miri, or at least it looked like her. I took a hesitant step forward, my hand tightening around the hilt of my laser gun. The figure shifted, as if acknowledging my movement, then began to walk toward me, its steps slow and deliberate, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. I couldn't make out her face, but there was something wrong about her posture, something off. Thale stepped forward as well, his voice low and cautious. "Miri, is that you?" The figure didn't respond. It just kept coming. I could feel a cold sweat breaking out across my brow, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. The whispers had started again, louder now, echoing through the fog like a distant choir calling me to the void. "Don't move," Thale warned, but it was too late. The figure reached out a hand, a grotesque, deformed hand, and that was all it took. I fired. The shot rang out in the silence, the bright flash of my laser gun cutting through the fog like a knife. The figure jerked back, its body twisting unnaturally, but it didn't fall. Instead, it let out a low, guttural growl, and its body began to change. Its form shifted and warped, like something pulling itself from the depths of the warp, its flesh tearing, its bones snapping and reforming into something unrecognizable. It wasn't Miri, not anymore. "What the hell is that?" I gasped, my voice shaking. "Chaos," Thaler whispered, his eyes wide with terror. "It's trying to break through. All this, it's trying to drag us in." The thing before us was no longer human. It was a creature of the warp, its skin stretched thin and rotting, its eyes now nothing but glowing pits of malice. It was the embodiment of the corruption that had been spreading through this place, and it was coming for us. We fought it off, barely. The creature lashed out, its claws raking across Thaler's chest, tearing through his armor as though it were paper. I fired, my shots barely making contact, but it was enough to drive the creature back into the fog, where it vanished as quickly as it had appeared. The whispering in my mind grew louder, more insistent, like the creature had left a piece of itself behind in my thoughts. "Is everyone all right?" Thaler grunted, his hand clutching his bleeding side. He looked at me, his eyes full of something I couldn't quite place. Fear, yes, but something else too, something darker. He turned to look around, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the mist. "Where's Miri?" I didn't answer. I couldn't. My heart was racing, my thoughts a whirlwind of confusion and doubt. Miri was gone. She had been lost to the infection, to the warp, and now I wasn't sure if anyone could be trusted. I looked around at the group, Thale, Dren, and myself, and I realized something. The infection wasn't just spreading through the city, it was spreading through us. We were all at risk, even from one another. The fog closed in tighter, the whispers now deafening in my mind. "It's too late. All of you are mine." I wasn't sure what was real anymore. The rest of the night passed in a blur. We kept moving, but every shadow, every flicker of movement made me question everything. The others didn't speak much. There was no need. The silence said it all. We were infected, in body and in mind. The fog was thick, suffocating, and it felt like we were walking deeper into a nightmare we would never wake from. By morning, we had lost something, more than just Miri, something that none of us could ever get back. We had been moving for days through the shattered remnants of the city, the fog ever thickening around us. Each step felt like a descent into madness, the weight of the warp pressing down on us like a vice. The whispers were louder than ever now, though I no longer trusted my own mind to discern where they came from. Were they real, or was the corruption of the warp finally breaking me? But it was the sight of the temple, half collapsed, draped in shadow and mystery, that finally shattered the last remnants of my resolve. It had been hidden away in the deepest part of the city, its entrance covered by debris and centuries of neglect. But as we had dug through the rubble, as we had ventured deeper into the heart of the city's forgotten underbelly, we had uncovered it. The whispers had led us here, and for once I didn't know if it was fate or the dark hand of chaos guiding us. Thiel was the first to speak when we stepped through the cracked doors. His voice was barely a murmur, but I heard the tremor in it. This place, it feels wrong. It was a temple, once dedicated to the Emperor, but now desecrated. The walls were covered in symbols of chaos, blood-red marks painted in the dust, wicked runes twisted into shapes that seemed to warp and shift before our eyes. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the very ground beneath our boots seemed to pulse with a dark energy. "Look at this," Dren muttered, his voice tight with fear as he gestured to the altar at the center of the room. The altar was not what I had expected. It was made of black stone, its surface covered in ancient bloodstains. The symbols etched into it were not of the Imperium, but of the dark gods, twisted sigils that glowed faintly, as though they were alive, waiting to claim us. Atop the altar lay something else, a book, bound in skin, its pages yellowed and brittle. It was open, revealing a ritual, an incantation of dark power. I felt my stomach twist. This was it, the ritual, the one they had been preparing all along. The ritual had begun, and it was worse than we had feared. I could feel it now, the weight of it. The air felt thick, charged with dark power, and I could hear the distant sounds of chanting rising from somewhere deep within the temple's bowels. It was impossible to ignore. The warp had torn open a rift on this planet, and it was beginning to pull everything into it, everything, including us. "The ritual," Miri whispered, her voice hoarse. "It's not just an offering, it's a summoning." I nodded, swallowing the lump in my throat. They're calling for something, something big. Thaler clenched his fists, his eyes hardening. "We need to stop this. We have to destroy that altar, burn that damn book, and end this ritual before it's too late." But even as he spoke, I could feel the ground tremble beneath our feet. Something was stirring. Something was awakening in the dark, beneath the surface of this city, beneath the very earth itself. It wasn't just the city that was at risk anymore. It was the whole damn planet. If the ritual was completed, if the forces of chaos were unleashed, there would be nothing left to save. Just as we began to make our move, the comms crackled. "Corvin, do you copy?" It was Lieutenant Grant's voice. His tone was grim, urgent. "I'm here," I replied, trying to steady my breathing. "What's happening? We're in position. We need to stop this ritual." "You need to get to Sector 9, Grant said, his voice tight. "There are survivors, civilians mostly, huddled in a makeshift shelter. They're under siege. We're losing men." I felt my stomach drop. Another choice, another impossible decision. "We can't leave," I said, my voice shaking with the weight of it. "This ritual is the only thing that matters now. If we don't stop it, nothing will matter." "Corvin," Gran interrupted, his voice hard. "There are civilians there, people who need help. If you don't act now, they'll be slaughtered." I closed my eyes, my pulse hammering in my ears. The tension between the two options was suffocating. Save the civilians or stop the ritual. Save a few lives or save everyone. I turned to the others. Miri was standing quietly, her face pale. Thaler was pacing, his hand clutching the laser gun, his mind clearly racing through the possibilities. Dren stood apart from the rest of us, his eyes distant. We were all lost in the same dilemma. "Do we really have a choice?" Thaler muttered, his voice low and bitter. If we don't stop this ritual, there won't be any survivors left. Not here, not anywhere. But those civilians, I started, but Miri cut me off. Thal's right, she said softly, her voice edged with fear. If we don't stop this, the planet is lost. The survivors, they'll die, yes, but we may be the last chance we have to stop the spread of this corruption. I looked at Dren. His face was unreadable, his thoughts hidden behind that quiet, calculating demeanor. But I saw the same doubt in his eyes, the same fear. We need to make a choice, I said quietly. We stop the ritual. We save this world. And with that, we turned our backs on the civilians, knowing that their fates were no longer in our hands. The warp had already claimed so much. It would claim more before we were finished. The closer we got to the altar, the more the air seemed to warp around us. The ground trembled again, and the chanting grew louder, its rhythm more frantic. Something was about to break. I could feel it. It was as if the very fabric of reality was tearing, and we were caught in the middle of it. Ready yourself, Thale said, his voice low as he took position beside me, his laser gun raised. We moved forward as a group, slow and deliberate, but every step felt like we were marching toward our own graves. The warp had a way of distorting reality, of turning every corner into a nightmare, and I was starting to lose track of what was real and what was part of the madness that was consuming us. We reached the altar. The book was still open, its pages moving as though a wind was passing through them, though the air was still. The sigils on the walls had grown darker, and the symbols now seemed to shift, changing before our eyes. This is it, I said, my voice barely a whisper. We burn it all. We prepared ourselves to destroy the altar, to stop the ritual before it could be completed. But then it happened. The ground shook violently beneath us, and I felt the very earth begin to crack open. From beneath the altar, something began to rise. A shadow, a shape, something ancient, something terrible. And that's when I knew. We had made the right choice, but it was already too late. The path had led us here, the center of the storm. I had no doubt anymore. The whispers, the corruption, the madness, it was all leading to one place. And that place was at the very heart of the city. The fog was no longer a mere obstacle. It had become a constant presence, enveloping us as though it had been waiting for our arrival. Thick and suffocating, the fog seemed to breathe with us, its movements echoing the slow, agonizing passage of time. It made everything feel unreal. Every step felt like we were walking through a nightmare, one that refused to end. We need to move fast, Thale said, his voice raspy, as if the very air itself was choking him. The longer we stay in this damn city, the more of us are going to break. He was right. The longer we stayed, the harder it became to keep our thoughts clear, our minds from unraveling. Every corner we turned, every shadow that loomed ahead, felt like a trap. And the whispers were never far behind. The city itself was a decaying shell, once teeming with life and activity, now reduced to a ghost town. The architecture was jagged and broken, once proud buildings now crumbling into dust. Streets were abandoned, filled only with the remnants of what had been. And still, the whispers echoed through the empty ruins. But it was not just the environment that had changed. It was us. We had learned the truth from a piece of ancient, charred text we had uncovered. The corruption, no, not a corruption, the virus, had not been unleashed by a simple plague or infection. It was the result of something much darker. A chaos artifact, long buried beneath the city, had been unearthed. The artifact, its true nature hidden beneath layers of lies and deception, had begun its terrible work. It was slowly bleeding into the planet's core, infecting everything it touched. The city was only the first place to succumb, and the artifact's influence had only spread, reaching its tendrils into the minds of the infected. It had taken years to find it, but now it was time to face it. The entrance to the chamber where the artifact lay was deep within the city's underground. The very foundations of the city had been built upon this site, so we had to venture into the lower tunnels, into the heart of the infection. The air grew colder as we descended, the faint hum of something ancient vibrating beneath our feet. I could feel it in my bones, an energy that was wrong, that belonged to a place outside of reality. The warp itself seemed to be leaking through the walls, saturating the very ground we walked on. We had to press on. There was no other choice. The fate of the planet, the fate of all the survivors, depended on stopping this ritual, on destroying the artifact before it could complete its task. But the longer we went on, the more it took from us. By the time we reached the depths of the city, I could see the toll it had taken on my squad. Thyla was the first to crack. His movements had become jerky, his eyes wild. He kept muttering to himself, repeating the same phrases over and over again like he was trying to anchor himself to something, anything that was real. His grip on his laser gun had tightened to the point where his knuckles were white. "Thale," I called out, but he didn't respond at first. He was lost in his thoughts, staring into the darkened passageway ahead of him. "Thale, Corvin." He blinked, his eyes clearing for a brief moment. "I'm fine, just fine." But I knew he wasn't. I could see it in his eyes. The toll of the journey, the madness of this place, was already starting to eat away at him. And it wasn't just Thale. Miri was quieter than usual, her gaze distant. Dren, usually so composed, had been pacing back and forth, his fingers twitching as if reaching for something unseen. It was the artifact. I knew it was. It had already begun to warp our minds. We reached the chamber just before dawn, the walls around us slick with sweat and the heavy weight of despair. The ground trembled with each step, and the hum of the artifact's power filled the air, low, guttural, vibrating through our very bones. It was like a heartbeat but wrong, like the pulse of something ancient, something beyond comprehension. And then we saw it. At the center of the room was the artifact, a jagged, pulsating mass of metal, bone, and something darker. It seemed to shimmer with a black light, its surface rippling like water in a storm. The runes carved into its surface were not just symbols. They were living things, squirming as though they had a life of their own. The room was vast, and in the dim light of our helmets, the shadows stretched far beyond our sight. The walls were covered in more symbols, more markings of chaos, and the air was thick with the stench of decay, of things that had no place in this world. I couldn't take my eyes off the artifact. There was a weight to it, a gravity that pulled at the deepest part of me. It called to me. I could feel it, deep in my chest, like a heavy hand pressing down on my soul. "This is it," Thale whispered, his voice hoarse. "This is what's been destroying everything." Miri looked at me, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "What do we do now?" I swallowed, my throat dry. The answer was clear, but the cost was too high. We destroy it. But as I said those words, I felt something shift. The air grew colder, the hum of the artifact intensifying, its power reaching out, wrapping around us like a noose. The whispers began again, louder this time, and I realized it was too late. The warp had already taken hold of us. We were already part of it. "Corvin!" Dren's voice broke through the haze, his eyes wide with fear. "What if we don't destroy it? What if we can use it?" I turned to him, my heart skipping a beat. The words were out before I could stop them. "What do you mean?" Dren took a step forward, his eyes locked on the artifact. "We've come this far. What if this is the only way to stop the infection? What if we can use it to turn the tide, to save what's left?" The doubt in his voice was like a knife to the heart. He wasn't just suggesting we leave the artifact alone. He was considering using it, embracing the power of chaos. I could see the temptation in his eyes, the pull of the darkness that had already claimed so much of this planet. "Don't," I said, my voice firm. "We came here to destroy it. That's the only way." But the weight of his words lingered in my mind, as though they were seeds planted, ready to grow into something darker. What if we didn't destroy it? What if there was another way? The whispers were getting louder, drowning out all rational thought. As the squad stood in the shadow of the artifact, I could feel the tension rising. Every breath felt heavier, every movement slower. The air was thick with the influence of the warp, and even the walls seemed to close in around us. We were running out of time. The decision had to be made. We had come here to destroy it. But as the minutes passed, the temptation to use it grew stronger, gnawing at our sanity, tearing at the very fabric of our thoughts. The planet was already lost, but could we save ourselves? We were so close. The artifact loomed ahead, just beyond our reach. Its pulsating, dark energy seemed to thrash and writhe like a living thing, calling us to come closer, to succumb to its power. The room, once filled with only the whispering calls of the warp, had now fallen silent. The darkness in this place was absolute, suffocating, and as I took step after step toward the artifact, it felt as though the weight of the entire planet was pressing down on us. The air was colder here than I had ever felt it before, and the walls, their cracked, jagged surface, seemed to close in around us, narrowing our way forward. Each step felt like a struggle against some unseen force. I could feel it, that pull, the very heartbeat of the planet itself thumping in time with my own. It called to me. The whispers in my mind had become louder now, their voices all-consuming. Come closer, Corvin. Embrace the truth. I shook my head violently, trying to banish the thoughts. This was no longer a choice. We had come here to destroy the artifact, to stop the ritual from consuming this world. But the power it held was undeniable. The deeper we ventured into this temple, the more it felt like we were marching into the very jaws of chaos. And I could feel it eating at me, tugging at the edges of my sanity. We need to keep moving, I said, my voice barely above a whisper, as though speaking too loudly might invite the madness to overwhelm us all. Thalie didn't respond immediately, but I could see it in his eyes. The doubt, the uncertainty. We had all been changed by what we'd seen and done. The horrors of the past weeks had taken their toll, and the temptation to yield was starting to show in the others as well. Miri had grown more distant, her face pale, her eyes hollow. She had been quieter than usual, lost in thought. I had seen the signs in her, her eyes darting to the artifact more and more, her hand trembling as if she wanted to reach out, to touch it. Dren was no better. He had become obsessed with the power it promised. I could see it in his eyes, the same longing, the same desire to claim the power that chaos offered. The whispers had taken him too. It was all too much. We can't stop now, Thale muttered, though his words seemed to ring hollow, even to him. He was trying to convince himself as much as he was trying to convince the rest of us. If we let this thing finish, the entire planet will fall. But what if it's already too late? Miri said, her voice quieter than usual. She stared at the artifact, her expression blank. What if the only way to end it is to embrace it? I froze. That was it. The pull of the artifact had taken hold of her, and now it was starting to twist her thoughts, to bend her to its will. No, I said firmly. We can't. You can't. This is not the way. But she didn't look at me. She didn't look at anyone. She was lost in the whispers now, in the promises of power, of a world reshaped by chaos. I could see the truth of it in her eyes, and the fear gripped me like a vice. Before I could say anything more, the room shook. The air vibrated with the unmistakable hum of something more powerful than anything we had encountered before. It was coming from behind us, closer than I had expected, and it wasn't just the artifact calling to us anymore. A figure stepped from the shadows, tall and imposing, its presence filling the room with an overpowering sense of dread. The air grew thick with the smell of sulfur and rot. I had seen the twisted forms of chaos before, but nothing like this. It was a sorcerer, cloaked in dark robes stitched with symbols of the warp. His eyes burned with a malevolent fire, and as he stepped forward, I could feel the very air around him bend and warp. This wasn't just any chaos sorcerer. This was something more. This was a being of true power, a herald of the dark gods themselves. His voice echoed in my mind, like 1,000 voices speaking in unison, each word carrying the weight of eternity. You are too late. The ritual is already in motion. There is no stopping it. Embrace the chaos and join the true power of the universe. I wanted to fight. I wanted to throw myself at him and end it all in one furious charge. But as I looked at the sorcerer, I could feel the weight of his power crushing me. Every thought was clouded, every action sluggish. I could feel the warp surging around me, pushing against my very soul. Corvin, you can feel it, can't you? Miri whispered. She had stepped closer to the sorcerer, her eyes locked onto his. This is the answer. This is the power we've been searching for. This is how we end it. Her voice sounded so distant, so strange. This wasn't the Miri I had fought alongside. This wasn't the woman who had kept us grounded when things had seemed impossible. This was something else, something far darker. You're wrong, I snapped. This is not the way. But it didn't matter. The sorcerer smiled, a cruel twist of his lips that made my stomach turn. You will see. You will all see. The warp is inevitable. It is destiny. He raised his hand, and suddenly the ground began to tremble beneath our feet. The air grew thick, suffocating, and the room was filled with a blinding, searing light. I could feel the pressure building, like a storm about to break. The sorcerer was feeding on the fear, on the confusion. He was using it, twisting it into something worse. We're not going to make it out of here, Thales said, his voice barely audible as he dropped to his knees, clutching his chest. It's too much. We've already lost. The room swirled and I could hear Dren's voice, now lost to the darkness, calling to me. You can join us. We can make it all stop. Power, glory. You don't have to fight anymore. It's all here, waiting for you. My heart pounded in my chest. I looked around at my squad, at the faces of the people I'd fought beside. They were fractured. Pieces of themselves were already lost, sucked into the void. I could see it in their eyes, their desire, their temptation. They were all tempted by the power of the warp. The sorcerer smiled wider, his hands raised to the sky as if summoning the forces of the universe itself. And then it happened. The ground shattered. We fought. We fought as we had always fought, against overwhelming odds, against a force that was far beyond anything we could have prepared for. I fired my laser gun blindly, trying to drown out the chaos, trying to focus on the task at hand. But it was like fighting shadows. The sorcerer was everywhere, his power too great to withstand. I could see Miri in the corner of my eye, her face twisted in agony, her hands reaching out to the sorcerer. She had already succumbed. She was already lost. But it wasn't just her. Dren had stepped forward too, his body language betraying the desire for something greater than himself. He reached for the power, for the chaos that had taken hold of him, and it was in that moment that I realized just how far we had fallen. The sorcerer's laughter filled the air, and as I fired one last shot, I saw it. I saw the rift, the warp itself, tearing open, ready to swallow us whole. It was too late. The temple trembled beneath our feet as the chaos swirled around us. I could feel it now, more than the growing corruption, more than the weight of the warp's influence pressing in on us. It was the feeling of inevitability. There was no escaping it, no way to go back. We had come so far, but now, as the rift in the fabric of reality cracked wide open in front of us, I realized how far we'd fallen. The sorcerer stood in the center of the chamber, his form writhing and shifting with the raw power of chaos. He was no longer just a man. He was something far worse, an extension of the warp itself, and the rift he had torn open was swallowing everything in its path. The screams of the damned echoed from the fissure, and the very air seemed to warp with the agony of those caught within. I could feel it, taste it, every time I breathed in the heavy, corrupted air. The smell of decay, the scent of madness. The whispers were louder now, louder than they had ever been before, clawing at the edges of my mind, urging me to give in, to let go, to embrace the chaos that had already claimed so many. Corvin. I turned, heart in my throat, to see Thales standing behind me. His face was pale, his eyes bloodshot. There was a tremor in his hands, the same tremor I had seen in Miri, in Dren. It was the same madness creeping in, the same corruption taking root. We can still stop this, I said, but even as I spoke, I knew it wasn't true. The warp had already taken hold. The city, the planet, everything was already lost. Thale's gaze flicked to Miri, who stood off to the side, her eyes wide, glassy. She was already so far gone. I could see it in her every movement, the way she was drawn to the rift, the way her hands twitched as if she were reaching for something far darker than anything we could comprehend. I don't know if I can fight it anymore, Corvin. Thale said, his voice cracking. I can feel it in my skin, in my soul. It's calling us. I know, I whispered, my heart sinking. But we can't give in. We can't let it take us. Before he could respond, a loud crash erupted from the darkness. The ground beneath our feet shook violently, sending us stumbling. I looked up just in time to see Dren, his body convulsing, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and something far darker, charge forward, his lasgun raised. No, Dren, don't, I shouted, but it was too late. He fired. A single, bright bolt of energy flew through the air and struck the rift. For a moment, time seemed to stop. The air cracked and warped, as if reality itself had been shattered by the blast. The rift screamed, a terrible noise that was both a roar and a whisper, a call to the damned. The sorcerer's laughter echoed through the chamber, rising above the noise. Foolish mortal, the sorcerer hissed, his eyes flashing with hatred. You think you can stop this? You think you can halt the inevitable? You cannot. The warp is eternal. The room exploded with energy. The rift widened, swallowing everything in its path. I could see the faces of the damned, twisted and contorted in agony, screaming for salvation that would never come. And then, amidst the chaos, I heard something that made my blood run cold. Corvin. Miri. Her voice softer than ever, but there was something different in it. Something hollow. Something wrong. I turned just in time to see her step forward, eyes fixed on the rift. Her hands trembled as they reached for it, her lips parting as she spoke something under her breath, an incantation, a prayer to the dark gods. She was beyond saving now, beyond reasoning. The warp had claimed her, body and soul. No, I whispered, my voice breaking. Miri, no. She didn't respond. Instead, she smiled, a sickening, hollow smile, before stepping into the rift. The world around me erupted in a chaotic, blinding light. The force of it slammed into me, pushing me back against the stone floor. My ears rang with the scream of the warp, the sound of destruction, of worlds being torn apart. When the light finally subsided, I could only hear the faint crackling of the rift, the whispered cries of those lost to the void. Miri was gone. I stumbled to my feet, my heart pounding, a deep, gnawing emptiness spreading within me. She was gone just like that, and now there was no one left. Thaler, Dren, Miri, they had all been consumed by the very force they had tried to resist, and I was the last one standing. But there was still work to be done. The artifact, the ritual. Thale was standing near the altar, his expression unreadable. He turned to face me, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and despair. He opened his mouth as if to say something, but the words caught in his throat. Thaler, I breathed, stepping toward him, but something was wrong. His eyes were glazed over, and the corruption had already begun to take hold. The darkness was pulling him in, just like it had with Miri and Dren. I could see it in the way he looked at me, the way his hands trembled as they reached for his lasgun. You don't have to do this, I said, my voice firm. We're not them. We can stop this. Thale shook his head, his mouth twisted into a grimace. I can't fight it anymore, Corvin. It's already in me. The whispers grew louder, pressing in on all sides. I could feel them, the promises of power, the temptation of the warp. It was in all of us, but I couldn't give in. I couldn't let it win. Thale raised his weapon, his hands shaking. I'm sorry, he whispered. I lunged forward, reaching for his weapon, but I was too slow. The lasgun discharged with a deafening crack. The world went silent. Thale fell to the ground, his body limp, his eyes empty. No, I whispered, falling to my knees beside him. No, you didn't have to. But it was too late. He was gone, just like Miri, just like Dren. I was the last one left. The rift was still open. The artifact still pulsed with dark power, its influence growing stronger with every passing second. I didn't know how much time I had left. I didn't know if I could hold on much longer, but I couldn't stop now. I had to finish this. I staggered toward the altar, my lasgun gripped tightly in my hand, my mind fractured with the horrors I had witnessed. I had no choice anymore. The ritual had to end. The final push, the final sacrifice. The air was thick with the stench of burning flesh, sulfur, and madness. I could taste it now, the bitter, metallic tang of defeat creeping into my mouth. The rift had grown wider, a gaping wound in reality itself, and with every passing second, the power of chaos seeped further into the world. I could feel it tearing through the very fabric of this place, and all I could think of was one thing: stopping it. But it wasn't going to be easy. We had come so far, had seen so much, and now, standing in the heart of this forsaken place, I realized how small we were in the grand scheme of things. This wasn't just a battle for survival, it was a battle for the fate of the entire planet. The power of chaos was rising, and if we couldn't stop the artifact now, if we couldn't end the ritual before it was too late, then this world would fall, and with it, everything we had fought for. I could feel the weight of that decision pressing down on me as the army of chaos cultists, demons, and corrupted soldiers surrounded us. We were vastly outnumbered, our strength slipping away with every breath. The last remnants of our squad were scattered across the broken ruins of the temple, their weapons drawn, ready for a fight they knew would likely be their last. There was no turning back now. "We do this now," Thalie said, his voice grim and determined. Despite everything, despite the madness that had claimed so many of our comrades, there was still a flicker of resolve in him. I nodded, my hands shaking as I gripped my laser gun. The artifact was ahead, pulsing with the dark energy of chaos, its surface slick with an unholy sheen. But between us and the artifact stood the full force of the cult. It wasn't just soldiers anymore. There were things moving in the shadows, twisted, deformed shapes that had once been men. And worse still, I could feel the presence of something ancient, something far more powerful, lurking just beyond the rift, waiting to emerge. "Form up," I shouted, my voice hoarse, cracking under the strain. But there was no choice. We had no time left. We pushed through to the artifact. We destroy it now. Thalie, Dren, and the others nodded grimly. We were the last line of defense, the last hope. It wasn't just the city we had to save. It was the entire planet. We stepped forward, our footsteps steady, but our hearts hammering in our chests. The Chaos cultists did not hesitate. They surged forward, screaming their dark prayers, their twisted faces contorted in savage glee. The air was filled with the crackling energy of the warp, and the ground beneath us shook as if the very planet itself was screaming in agony. The first wave hit us like a hammer. I fired into the mass of bodies, my laser gun flashing with each shot, but it barely slowed them down. Thalie was beside me, his own weapon blazing, cutting down cultist after cultist, but the numbers were overwhelming, and the further we advanced, the stronger the resistance became. We fought with everything we had, but I could feel our strength waning with every passing moment. The rift had drained us, had eaten away at our resolve. We were fighting against the inevitable. I heard a scream to my left. It was Miri. I turned in time to see her fall, her body writhing as a massive chaos beast, some mutated creature of nightmares, tore into her. Her laser gun was still in her hand, but her fingers had gone limp and she had fallen to the ground, her blood mixing with the dirt beneath her. I rushed forward, my heart pounding, but there was nothing I could do. The creature's maw snapped shut, and Miri was lost to us, her sacrifice nothing more than a momentary distraction for the forces of chaos. I could feel the fury building inside me, the anger rising like a fire. But it wasn't just anger anymore. It was despair. This was it. We were going to lose. The weight of Miri's death, of all the lives that had been lost, was pressing down on me, and I could feel the ground shifting beneath my feet. I turned to Thalie, my voice shaking. "We need to make a choice. We can't keep fighting like this." "We fight," Thalie spat, his face contorted with rage. "We fight until the end." The rift screamed in the distance, and I could see it, something emerging from the other side, something dark and ancient. The sorcerer, the master of this ritual. His eyes burned with malice, and I could feel his gaze piercing into me, searching for my weakness. "You are too late," he snarled, his voice booming in the distance. "All of you are mine." A flood of demons poured from the rift, their eyes glowing with the fire of the warp. The ground shook as they descended, and for a moment I felt as if the world itself was crumbling around me. Thalie took a step forward, his voice low. "We can still stop this." But I knew the truth I had been fighting to deny. The artifact was too powerful. The ritual was already too far gone. We had come too late. We pushed forward, fighting through wave after wave of cultists and creatures, but our strength was fading. I could see it in the eyes of my comrades, the same doubt, the same weariness, the same realization that we were fighting a losing battle. And then, amidst the chaos, I heard it, the voice. Corvin. It was Miri's voice, soft and pleading, just like it had been before. It echoed through the rift, taunting me, pulling me in. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. I can't fall for it." But the voice was louder now, stronger. The whispers had turned into a chorus, a legion of voices calling to me, telling me that there was no escape, that the only way to save this world was to join the warp, to embrace the power that it offered. And in that moment I saw it, the truth. The truth was that we had already failed. We were already lost. The planet was already corrupted beyond repair. But there was still one choice left, one last thing we could do. I turned to Thalie, my eyes meeting his. His expression was hollow, his body trembling with the strain, but I could see the same realization in his eyes. We had already fought for so long, for so much, but now there was only one way to end this. "Thalie," I said, my voice cracking. "We end it. Now we destroy the artifact." Thalie nodded silently, his face hardening as he stepped forward. He reached for the detonator at his waist, the last hope we had to stop the corruption from spreading further. He hesitated for a moment, glancing back at me, his eyes filled with sorrow. "This is it, Corvin," he said softly. "This is the end." And with that, he pressed the button. The explosion was deafening. A blinding flash of light filled the room, and for a moment I felt as if I was floating, weightless, suspended between the living world and the void. But when the light faded, all that remained was silence. The rift was gone. The artifact was no more. And the city, the planet, the galaxy, they were all still standing. But the cost was unimaginable. The silence that followed the explosion was deafening. The rift had closed. The artifact shattered into countless pieces of twisted metal and bone. The air, thick with the scent of burning corruption, slowly began to clear. For a brief moment, I thought we had won. The virus had been stopped, the corruption contained, the planet saved. But as the dust settled, the weight of what we had done, the price we had paid, began to sink in. I looked around at my remaining comrades, Thalie, Dren, and myself, 3 survivors of a battle that had claimed so many others. The others, Miri, the others who had fallen, our friends, our squad, were gone. And for what? To stop an infection that had already taken root in our souls. To fight a war we had no business winning. We had used the warp to defeat the warp. And now we were left with the consequences. I could feel it in my bones, the price of what we had done. The dark energy that had once threatened to tear the planet apart had been sealed, but the cost had been more than just the lives of our comrades. The artifact, when we destroyed it, had released a final burst of energy. A burst so powerful that it had scorched the very earth beneath us, leaving the land scarred, twisted beyond recognition. But there had been another effect, something far more dangerous than any physical damage. The warp's influence had bled into us. Thalie had been the first to show signs. At first it was subtle. His eyes seemed too bright, too intense, as though there was something not quite right behind them. Then the whispers started, quiet at first, just faint voices in his head, but soon they grew louder. I watched as he began to lose control, fighting to keep his grip on reality, while the dark presence inside him gnawed at his sanity. I could feel it too, the whispers, the strange sensations like something was watching me from the corners of my vision. At night, I would wake, sweating and gasping, my mind consumed with nightmarish images, twisted faces, warped landscapes, and the voice of the sorcerer who had tried to kill us, taunting me, reminding me of the price of what we had done. The virus had been contained, the cult was eradicated, their plans thwarted, the rift sealed, but the warp had left a scar on this planet and on us. It wasn't just our minds that had been damaged. We had been changed, transformed by the very forces we had sought to destroy. The artifact had reached into our souls, and now we could feel its touch, its corruption, eating away at the core of who we were. Dren was no different. His once strong resolve had begun to crack under the pressure. He had been quiet for days now, barely speaking, his movements slower, more erratic. There was a hollow look in his eyes, and I could see him fighting to hold on to his humanity. But it was a battle he was losing. "We did it," Thal said, his voice ragged. "We stopped it. The virus, the corruption, it's over." But there was no joy in his words, no relief. I nodded, but the victory felt hollow. We had won the war, but lost ourselves in the process. I could feel the warp pulling at my own thoughts now, tempting me with promises of power, of knowledge. The price of victory wasn't just our lives, it was our souls, and there was no escaping that. We moved through the ruined city, the streets eerily silent. The once thriving metropolis was now a shell of its former self. Buildings lay in ruins, charred husks of what they had been, and the stench of death still clung to the air. The ground was scarred, warped by the forces we had unleashed, a permanent reminder of what we had done. The world was broken, but it was still here. The planet had been saved, but I could not shake the feeling that we had made a terrible mistake. The whispers had not gone away. They had only grown stronger. The power of chaos still lingered in the air, and I could feel it crawling under my skin, seeping into my thoughts. The warp's touch had changed us. It had marked us, and no matter how hard I tried to ignore it, I knew deep down that we would never be the same again. We had saved the planet, but at what cost? The planet was scarred, yes, but so were we. And as we made our way through the wreckage, I couldn't help but wonder, had it all been worth it? Was there any victory to be found when we had given so much of ourselves in exchange for it? We had stopped the virus, we had destroyed the artifact, sealed the rift, but the price was steep. And as I looked around at the wreckage, the faces of my surviving comrades, I realized that there would be no true peace for us. Not now, not ever. Tharley stood at the edge of a ruined building, staring out over the city. His hands were trembling, his eyes distant, as if he were lost in the very thoughts I had been battling with for days. "We did it," he whispered again, but there was no triumph in his voice. I stood beside him, looking out over the devastation. The city, the planet, it was still standing, but it had been broken, just like us, and there would be no going back. I felt the weight of it all, the burden of what we had sacrificed, the lives lost, the friends we had buried, and now, as I stood here, the whispers still echoing in my mind, I knew that we had saved the planet, but lost ourselves in the process. The virus was contained, the corruption was stopped, but the warp had claimed us, and there would be no escaping it. The horizon stretched before me, a bleak, empty canvas. Once, this planet had been full of life, cities buzzing with activity, people laughing, families gathering. But now it lay in ruins, shattered by the dark forces we had unleashed and fought to contain. The world was scarred, a barren wasteland of burnt-out buildings, broken earth, and lifeless streets. We had won the battle. We had saved the planet from total corruption, from the unchecked spread of the virus, from the destruction that chaos had threatened to bring. But standing here, amidst the remains of what was once a thriving world, I wondered if victory was truly something to celebrate. Thale, Dren, and I moved slowly through the wreckage. The ground beneath our feet felt soft, as though the very earth had been twisted by the warp. The once proud skyscrapers were now nothing more than twisted skeletons, their frames blackened and crumbling. What was once a city of hope, of progress, now stood as a monument to our failure. I could feel it in the air, the weight of despair, of death. It clung to us, to the planet itself. And no matter how hard I tried to push the thoughts from my mind, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were walking through the ashes of our own souls. "There's nothing left," Dren muttered, his voice hollow, barely audible. "We've killed everything. The city, it's gone." I didn't respond immediately. What could I say? He was right. The people who had once walked these streets were either dead or corrupted. The army we had once fought for had been consumed by chaos, either through death or betrayal. The rift, the artifact, it had done more than just corrupt us. It had infected everything it touched, and now there was nothing left but ruins. We did what we had to, Thale said, his voice more fragile than I had ever heard it. He wiped a hand across his face as if to clear away the grime, but it was clear to me that the battle had taken more from him than just his strength. The lines of doubt, of fear, were etched deep into his face. We stopped it. We stopped them. But did we? I asked, my voice breaking the silence. Did we really stop it? Or did we just delay the inevitable? Thale's silence spoke volumes. He didn't have an answer, and I didn't expect him to. The planet, the city, the very air itself had been changed. The warp's influence was no longer just a distant, unfathomable threat. It was here, in every crack in the ground, in every breath we took. The rift had been sealed, yes, but the corruption had already seeped into the very core of the world. It had touched everything, and now it was in us, too. I could feel it, deep inside me, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts, clawing at my sanity. The whispers were still there, just beneath the surface, waiting for a moment of weakness to push through. No matter how many times I told myself I was free, no matter how many times I tried to convince myself that we had succeeded, I knew the truth. We had destroyed the artifact, but the virus had already infected us. As we trudged through the ruins, we came across one of the few remaining survivors, an old man crouched in the remains of a collapsed building. His eyes were wide with fear, his clothes ragged, his face pale and gaunt from hunger and exhaustion. He looked at us, his eyes filled with a mixture of hope and disbelief. You're alive? He asked, his voice shaking. Is it over? Is the infection gone? I opened my mouth to speak, but no words came. What could I tell him? That the infection was contained, but the planet would never be the same. That the world was still scarred by the warp's influence, and that there was no going back. Instead, I simply nodded, my heart heavy with the weight of the lie. It's over. We moved on, the silence between us growing thicker, heavier. The world around us felt dead, as though life itself had been sucked from the planet and replaced by something darker, something alien. The sun hung low in the sky, its light weak and tainted, casting long, grotesque shadows across the shattered landscape. I couldn't stop thinking about the cost. The price of victory had been steep. We had saved the planet, yes, but at what cost? We had destroyed the artifact, closed the rift, but in doing so, we had sacrificed more than just our comrades. We had lost a part of ourselves, and now there was nothing left to return to. I glanced at Thale and Dren, their faces etched with exhaustion, their movements slow and labored. They too felt the weight of what had been lost. We had been changed, broken by the very forces we had fought to contain. We had paid the price to save this world, but the question gnawed at me, just as it had since the moment we set foot on this planet. Was it worth it? I didn't have the answer. The wind picked up as we walked, kicking up dust from the ruins of the city. The air was thick with the stench of decay, and the sky above us, once a bright blue, was now shrouded in a hazy, sickly yellow. It felt as though the world was dying, even as it still clung to life. And with each step, I could feel that death creeping closer, not just to the planet, but to us. We were survivors. But survivors of what? I could feel the warp deep in my soul, crawling through the cracks of my mind. The whispers were louder now, no longer distant. They were here, in my head, twisting my thoughts. And as I stood there, staring out over the ruins of the city, I realized that we would never be the same. The price of victory had been more than just the lives we had lost. It had been our very humanity. The planet might have been saved, but the war was far from over. The rift had closed, but the corruption still lingered, just beneath the surface. And as I looked out at the shattered world before me, I knew that this was only the beginning. The warp had claimed this world, and no matter how much we fought, no matter how many battles we won, It would never truly let go. The first signs of the galaxy learning of our planet's fate came in the form of cold, authoritative orders from the Imperium. Messages, encrypted and terse, began flooding the communications network, each one more dispassionate than the last. Reports of our success in sealing the rift, of the eradication of the Chaos Cult and the containment of the virus had spread far beyond our reach, but so had the repercussions. The Imperium did not celebrate victories, it demanded obedience. It measured success not by the cost of lives or the weight of sacrifice, but by the preservation of order. And in the wake of what we had done, what we had witnessed, and how we had fought, the Emperor's gaze felt heavier than ever. The first Imperial forces arrived days after the battle had ended. Their fleet descended upon the planet like a storm, bringing with it both salvation and condemnation. A heavy blockade of ships positioned themselves in orbit while dropships descended, unloading the Emperor's will in the form of Adeptus Astartes, Inquisitors, and Guardsmen who had been summoned to restore order. I stood with Thale and Dren on the outskirts of the devastated city, watching the first transport shuttles land. Each one carried a squad of Imperial Guardsmen, dressed in their pristine golden armor, their faces hidden behind their helms. They were here for one reason: to ensure that the planet was quarantined, sealed off from the rest of the galaxy. We had done our part, but the consequences were just beginning to unfold. Quarantine, Thale said bitterly, his voice barely above a whisper, as if the planet wasn't already sealed in darkness. They're here to contain us, I muttered under my breath, and we're the first to face judgment. The Adeptus Mechanicus arrived shortly thereafter, their robed figures descending into the ruins, their mechanical limbs clicking as they surveyed the city. They began scouring the surface for signs of corruption, of residual chaos influence, their sterile voices echoing over the comms as they dictated their findings. A heavy silence hung over the ruins, broken only by the occasional murmur of the Imperial forces. It felt as though the galaxy had turned its back on us, on everything we had fought for. The survivors of our squad were all we had left, but even we could sense the shadow of judgment closing in on us. The Inquisitor arrived in the late afternoon. Her shuttle descended from the skies, a sleek black craft with the Emperor's seal emblazoned on its side. When she stepped out, I immediately recognized her as one of the most feared figures in the Imperium, a representative of the Emperor's own will. Her name was Inquisitor Arcia, and her eyes, cold, calculating, sized us up the moment she stepped onto the dust-covered soil. Her gaze swept over the ruins of the city and then fixed on us, her every movement precise, measured. "You are the survivors," she said, her voice firm, unwavering. There was no greeting, no pleasantries, just cold authority. "You will accompany me to the Imperial Command Center. Your actions will be reviewed." I opened my mouth to speak, but Dren, usually the one to hold his tongue, stepped forward first. "We've done what was necessary," he said, his voice tinged with frustration. "The planet was saved, the virus, the rift, everything is contained. What more do you want from us?" Arcea's gaze narrowed, and her lips curled into something resembling a smile. "It wasn't kind. The price of your actions is not for me to determine," she said, stepping closer, her boots crunching on the charred ground. "But I will remind you, guardsmen, that the Emperor's justice is absolute, and the consequences of disobedience are not easily forgiven." The weight of her words hit me like a hammer. We were taken aboard the Imperial shuttle, and as we ascended into the sky, I couldn't help but look down at the planet. The once thriving world was now a lifeless husk, its surface scarred by the battle we had fought to survive. But it wasn't just the planet that had been changed. We had been too, and I could feel the pull of something dark still lingering inside me, a touch of the warp's influence that refused to leave. The journey to the command center was short, but it felt like an eternity. Once inside, we were separated. Thale in one room, Dren in another, and myself in yet another. The room I found myself in was cold, clinical, steel walls, no windows, a single table, and a chair. It felt like an interrogation chamber, and for all I knew, that's exactly what it was. I sat in silence for what felt like hours, waiting for the inevitable judgment to come. Finally, the door opened, and Inquisitor Arcia entered, followed by 2 armed guards. She didn't speak right away, simply paced in front of me, her boots clicking loudly on the floor. "I've read your report," she began, her voice flat, uninterested. "I've spoken with the surviving personnel. You've contained the virus, closed the rift, destroyed the artifact. You've saved the planet. But what you fail to understand, Guardsman, is that the Imperium does not operate on absolutes. The price of your victory is far greater than you realize." I stayed silent, my thoughts racing. "Weapons were used in the fight against the warp," she continued, her gaze never leaving mine. "Forces you have no business wielding. You've meddled with the very fabric of the warp itself, and I am here to determine if your actions were justified, or if the taint you've now brought upon yourself and this world is too great to ignore." She sat across from me, her gaze piercing. "You should be proud of what you've done," she said, her voice suddenly softer, almost mocking. "You saved billions of lives, including your own. But in doing so, you have forged a new path, a dangerous one. The Emperor does not look favorably on those who resort to forbidden means to achieve their goals." I clenched my fists, the anger rising in my chest. "What are you implying?" I asked, my voice rough. Arcea didn't flinch. "What are we to do with you now? How are we to be certain that you haven't been corrupted? How are we to be certain that you haven't opened a door that can never be closed?" I had no answer. How could I? We had done what had to be done, but at what cost? As the hours passed and the interrogations continued, I felt the pressure growing, the weight of it all pushing me closer to the edge. The Inquisitor and the officers were relentless, digging into every action, every decision, every detail. The weight of their judgment was suffocating, and by the end of it, I felt small, insignificant, just another cog in the machine of the Imperium. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Arcia delivered her verdict. "Your actions have saved the planet, but at a cost," she said, her voice cold. "You have walked the line between heroism and heresy, and now you must live with the consequences. For now, you are exonerated. But understand this, Corvin. The Emperor is not blind. The price of your victory will follow you, and you will answer for it one day." I was left alone in the chamber again, the weight of her words hanging over me like a cloud. The galaxy would never understand the sacrifices we had made. They would never see the truth of what we had done. We had fought to save a planet, to save humanity, but what had we really saved? I couldn't shake the question. The Emperor's justice, the Imperium's will. What was the price of victory? And at what cost did we truly earn it? We were given little more than a shuttle, a few rations and an order. "Await your fate." That was all. No fanfare, no honor, no final salute. The remnants of our squad, just a handful of us, were loaded into a transport bound for a distant world, one far from the ruined city we had once called home. A world that, in its isolation, seemed as empty as the ones we had left behind. Thaler, Dren and I sat together in the dimly lit cabin, the hum of the engines the only sound that filled the oppressive silence. The others, those who had survived the chaos, the deaths, the corruption, were scattered across the transport, each lost in their own thoughts, none daring to speak. I could still feel the weight of the rift, the dark power of the artifact pressing down on me. It was inside me, gnawing at the edges of my thoughts, reminding me of the price I had paid, and the price we had all paid. The planet was saved, but it had claimed us. The shuttle jolted as we entered the atmosphere of the distant world, a barren rock far from the heart of the Imperium. It was an unremarkable place, a temporary holding ground, but it felt like a prison. And as the hatch opened, I felt the cold, biting air rush in, as though it were trying to expel us from the warmth of the shuttle into the isolation we so rightfully deserved. I stepped off the craft, my boots crunching on the icy ground, and looked around. The world was bleak, a vast expanse of grey terrain stretching in all directions. Nothing, not a living soul in sight. The place seemed as dead as the memories of our fallen comrades. I couldn't escape the feeling of emptiness. the feeling that we were being exiled from a world that had already moved on without us. Days passed in silence. The only company we had were the occasional patrols that came to check on us, their faces grim and emotionless, like everything else in this forsaken place. We were forgotten here, left to rot in the shadow of our own failure. Dren spent most of his time in the corner of the barracks, fiddling with his rifle, his fingers twitching as if the very act of assembling his weapon gave him some semblance of peace. Thalie, on the other hand, had become a ghost, his eyes hollow, his every movement slow, as if he were carrying the weight of the planet's destruction on his shoulders. And me, I was no better. I couldn't stop thinking about it. The battle, the sacrifice, the ones we had lost. I could still hear their voices. I could still see their faces, etched into my mind as if they had never truly left. Miri's laugh, that carefree sound, so full of life, was gone. The memory of her standing beside me in the trenches, urging us forward despite the fear and the madness, was still fresh in my mind. I could almost see her face now, hear her quiet prayers as we fought together, side by side. But I had failed her. Dren, the calm, quiet one, the one who always knew the right words to say, the one who had kept us grounded when the madness of the warp threatened to consume us all. I could still remember the way he had stood up against the rift, unflinching, even when the very fabric of reality was unraveling before us. He had believed in us, in the Imperium, even when all hope seemed lost. I had failed him too. Thalie, the fiery one, always ready to charge into battle, to fight until the very end. He had been the one to keep us moving, even when the horrors around us seemed too much to bear. I could still see his face, his eyes burning with determination as he held his weapon in the heat of battle. His voice had been one of the last things I had heard before the rift closed, urging us forward when we thought all was lost. But I had failed him too. The memories gnawed at me. They wouldn't let me rest. I had survived, but in the process I had lost everything. I woke in the middle of the night, drenched in sweat, my breath coming in short, shallow gasps. The nightmares had returned. The vision of Miri's final moments, her body writhing in the grip of the chaos beast, would not leave me. The faces of Dren and Thalie, frozen in their last moments, their eyes filled with confusion and terror, haunted me. I could still hear their voices, their screams, as the warp's corruption claimed them, one by one. I lay in the darkness, the cold creeping into my bones, unable to shake the feeling that I was being swallowed by the very guilt I had tried so hard to outrun. There was no escaping it. No amount of distance, no amount of time could undo the horrors we had seen, the choices we had made. The infection was gone, yes, but the true cost was buried deep within us, waiting to break free. I stood up, shaking, my hands trembling as I ran them over my face. I couldn't stay here any longer. I couldn't keep hiding from it, from them, from the loss. I found Thalie in the mess hall, staring blankly at his ration pack. He didn't even look up when I sat across from him. "I keep thinking about them," I said quietly, my voice rough from lack of use. "I keep hearing their voices, in my head, in my dreams." Thalie didn't respond right away, but his eyes were hollow, the same haunted look that had been in mine for days. Finally he spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're still with us," he said, his words slow, as if each one pained him. "Their sacrifice, their fight, it's not gone. They're still here, Corvin, in our heads, in our hearts." I shook my head, the weight of his words pressing down on me. "I don't know how much longer I can live with this," I admitted, my voice breaking. Thalie nodded, understanding more than anyone could. "We carry their memory," he said softly, "but we have to live. We have to keep going. We owe it to them." We stayed in silence for what seemed like an eternity, neither of us knowing what came next. The future was a blur, and the past was a nightmare we couldn't outrun. I wandered through the barren landscape later that day, the wind howling through the empty expanse. I could see the remnants of a once thriving world, reduced to ash and ruin, and I wondered, as I stood there amidst the wreckage, if we had truly stopped the virus, or if it had just found a new host. Perhaps it was never the virus we were meant to destroy. Perhaps it was the darkness within us. The sky was always grey now. Even when the sun was visible, rarely, its light was muted, sickly, as though the planet itself had absorbed the horrors we had unleashed. It felt as though nothing would ever be the same again. The ground still trembled beneath our feet at times, and I often wondered if it was the planet rebelling against us, against the damage we had inflicted. It had been weeks since the rift closed, weeks since the chaos cults had been driven back, but the weight of what we'd done lingered in the air like a heavy fog. There were whispers now, rumors that the infection, the virus, the demon we had destroyed was not the end of our suffering. The infection had been contained, yes, but the corruption, it had left something behind. "I hear there are disturbances in other systems," Dren said one evening, his voice low and strained, as if he had been carrying this news alone for too long. "Reports from the outer rim, strange things, signs of chaos where there should be none." I looked up from my hands, the trembling fingers a familiar constant reminder that I wasn't quite whole. "What do you mean, signs of chaos?" I asked, my voice cracking. I couldn't bear the thought. I thought we had stopped it. I thought we had won. Dren's gaze hardened and he shifted uncomfortably. "Reports of warp anomalies, strange rifts, ships gone missing, disturbances in systems already under Imperial control, and whispers of something worse coming." Worse? I felt my heart race, the suffocating grip of panic creeping back into my chest. The warp hadn't just infected the planet, it had left its mark on us, on me, and now it seemed it had spread farther than I could have imagined. In the days that followed, the rumors only grew. Strange occurrences began to spread across the Imperium. A fleet vanishing without a trace in the Vishara system. A colony on the edge of the Segmentum Obscurus reporting ghostly voices emanating from the depths of their minds. And worse still, I had heard of new cults, cultists that hadn't just embraced chaos, but seemed to have somehow summoned it. They were not just worshippers, they were now the agents of it, serving as channels for the warp itself. A new kind of taint was spreading. I stood alone one night on the barren plains, staring out at the horizon. The land was empty, cold, a reflection of the world we had just begun to understand. The shadows, though, those I could still feel. At times they felt like they were watching me, like they were moving just outside my vision. I couldn't escape them. I couldn't escape it. The presence, the whispering, distant voices that had followed us since the battle. I had heard them again, the faintest murmurs, just beneath my breath, like someone whispering my name. Corvin. I had tried to ignore it. I had tried to pretend it wasn't real, but every time I closed my eyes, every time I breathed too deeply, they were there, and I knew they weren't just in my mind. The worst part of it all was that I wasn't the only one hearing them. I wasn't the only one feeling the eyes of the warp on me. The others, Thale, Dren, the few remaining survivors, had begun to show signs. Thaler, once so sure of himself, had started staring off into space, his eyes vacant, lost somewhere far beyond this world. Dren had grown quieter than ever, withdrawn, as though he was seeing things I could never understand. The air had thickened around us, heavy with unspoken fear, and the worst part was that it wasn't just us. Other systems were reporting the same thing. What had we released into the galaxy when we destroyed that artifact? Was the planet's corruption the end, or had it only been the beginning? The first real sign that something far darker was at play came when a scout vessel returned from the Corvus Expanse, bearing a grim report. The captain, his face haggard and eyes wide with terror, had barely been able to speak. "There were things, Sergeant," he said, his voice trembling. "Moving in the fog, something alien, something that shouldn't be. We've seen the signs before, warp anomalies, mutations, but this..." He shuddered, his eyes darting nervously. These weren't just cultists, they were shaped by the warp, made the presence was becoming undeniable. The warp wasn't just lingering, it was waking up. Within hours, Imperial forces began mobilizing. The Inquisition, ever watchful for signs of corruption, issued immediate orders to prepare for a new wave of eradication. Quarantine zones, reinforced by Adeptus Astartes and the Inquisition's finest, were set up across the galaxy's fringes. It seemed the damage was already done. Even worlds untouched by the virus were showing symptoms of the infection: warp echoes, erratic psychic phenomena, distortions in space itself. And just as quickly as the forces moved in, so did the new forces. New enemies, drawn by the rift's residual energy, began appearing in distant star systems. Warp-touched creatures and demons, their forms hideous and unnatural. The veil between real space and the Imperium had been weakened, and now the galaxy was paying for it. Thale and Dren stood by the communication terminals, the holographic display flickering as the latest reports came in. I walked toward them, my boots heavy with the weight of what was coming. "Is it happening everywhere?" I asked quietly, though I already knew the answer. Dren nodded, his face pale. "It's spreading faster than we can control. The Imperium is scrambling to put out fires everywhere. Cultists, demons, rifts, they're all over the place, and it's getting worse. And we're supposed to wait here?" Thale's voice was rough, almost incredulous. "While the galaxy burns." I met his gaze, his eyes burning with anger and fear. "What else can we do? We're just a few survivors. We've already done everything we could, and it wasn't enough." The question lingered in the air, unanswered, but the reality was clear. We had merely bought time. The damage was already done, and the price for victory was not a singular cost. It was a lasting curse, one that would follow us until the galaxy itself fell to the darkness. For now, we were in waiting. We were nothing more than witnesses, trapped in the aftermath of a battle we thought we had won. But something was coming, something worse than any of us had anticipated. The demons were returning, and we were no longer sure whether we had sealed the warp away or merely opened the door for it to come back. The nightmares had returned. At first, I thought they were just a lingering side effect of the madness we had endured, a culmination of the hours spent in the trenches, the horrors of the warp leaking into my subconscious like a poison. But now, weeks later, I wasn't so sure. The dreams weren't fading. They were becoming clearer, more insistent. It started with the shadows, dark, ever-moving shapes just beyond the edge of my vision, flickering like dying stars. They whispered to me, calling my name, their voices familiar but distorted, too familiar. I could never make out the words, but their tone was unmistakable, taunting, mocking, like a constant reminder that I had failed. The faces of my fallen comrades followed me into these dreams, Dren's empty eyes staring at me in silence, Thale's grin as he stood, once so full of confidence, now rotted and decayed, and then Miri, her face, her laugh, gone in an instant, replaced by a bloated, grotesque form, writhing and twisting with the same warp taint I had fought so hard to destroy. I woke up each time, drenched in sweat, gasping for air, my heart pounding in my chest, but the fear never left. The visions, the whispers, they were there every time I closed my eyes. They felt real, too real. The worst of it came when I found myself standing in the ruins of the cathedral we had once visited, the one we thought we had purged of its dark influence. The air was thick with the scent of blood, decay, and something else, something ancient pulling at me. I walked through the desecrated halls, my boots crunching on the bones of the long dead, the stone walls shaking with the whispers of the warp. The altar was still there, covered in the black, oily stains of past rituals. I stepped closer, drawn to it as though it were calling to me, and there, on the altar, lay a figure, half human, half beast. It was not a corpse, not something I could recognize, but I could feel it deep within me. It was the same power I had fought to contain, now reaching out to claim me. I reached out a trembling hand, as though compelled by some unseen force. I woke up again, shaking, heart hammering in my chest. The shadows in my room seemed to loom larger, the edges of reality bending as though the veil between worlds had thinned once more. My breath came in short bursts, and I could feel something in me, something wrong, twisting beneath my skin. I wasn't sure if it was the remnants of the warp's taint or something else, something worse. but I could feel it taking root in me. I had to push it down, I had to fight it. But the whispers were louder. Days passed, but the nightmares never stopped. My reflection in the mirror had begun to change too. My eyes, once a deep brown, now looked hollow, dark, too dark. I saw something in them, something I didn't want to admit, something that wasn't mine. I was losing myself. It was inevitable. The Inquisitor had been watching me for days. She knew. I was summoned to her quarters, the cold stone walls pressing in around me. The flickering light of a single candle illuminated her face, casting shadows across her sharp features. Her eyes, cold and assessing, scanned me like a predator preparing to strike. "You're different," Inquisitor Arcea said, her voice low, measured. She was standing by the table, her hands folded in front of her. "You've been distant, distracted. Your behavior has become erratic, unpredictable." I stiffened, trying to mask my unease. "I've been through a lot," I said, my voice harsh. "We all have." She nodded, her gaze not leaving mine. "Yes, but you, guardsman, have been affected more than the others. You carry something with you, something dark. I've been reviewing the reports. Your squad's actions, your decisions, they don't add up. You think you've sealed the warp, but I think it's still inside you." I clenched my fists at my sides, my heart beating faster. "What are you implying?" I asked, my voice steady but strained. Arcea stepped closer, her eyes narrowing. "I'm implying that the rift you sealed, the artifact you destroyed, they didn't just vanish. The warp never truly leaves. It leaves its mark. And you're marked, Corvin. I can see it in your eyes. I can feel it in your presence." I flinched, feeling the full weight of her words crash down on me. My pulse quickened. Could she know? Was she speaking of the nightmares, the whispers, the hunger I felt deep inside me? "You are not free from this," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "And neither is the planet. You carry the taint of chaos, and if I'm wrong, you'll prove it by facing the truth of what you've become. But if I'm right..." I cut her off, stepping forward. "What are you going to do about it?" My voice wavered, but I could hear the edge in it. The last vestiges of my will clung to me, desperate to stay intact. Her lips curled into a thin smile, one that did not reach her eyes. "I will do what is necessary for the Emperor's will. The question is, Corvin, what will you do?" The interrogation was cold, clinical. She had nothing but questions, none of which I could answer. All I had were doubts, fragments of memories I couldn't piece together. But I knew something had changed in me. Something was growing inside me, a shadow that refused to fade. "Why did you hesitate?" she asked, leaning in, her eyes burning into mine. "Why did you hesitate to kill the demon, to destroy it once and for all?" I swallowed, the question tearing at my insides. I had been hesitant, hadn't I? But why? Was it weakness? Compassion? Or had I too been seduced by the very force I had fought to destroy? "I didn't hesitate," I said, my voice cracking. I did what had to be done, for the planet, for the Imperium." She studied me for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "If that's true, then prove it. Because right now, all I see is a man who has already begun to break." When I left her chambers, the air felt colder. The whispers still echoed in my mind, louder now than ever. The shadow within me had grown darker, more insistent, and I couldn't escape it. I was losing myself, but I had to hold on. I had to. I paced the room later that night, trying to shake off the lingering dread that had settled into my bones. The walls seemed to close in, the shadows stretching unnaturally long. I could feel the weight of Arcea's words pressing on me, suffocating me. Was I truly tainted? Had the warp's influence claimed me, even after all we had done? I didn't know. But the whispers were louder now, and they weren't just in my mind anymore. The orders came down with cold finality. Purge the infection. Eliminate the source. Do not return until the planet is cleansed. They had been brief, precise, and I could feel the weight of them in my chest tightening with each word. The Inquisition had spoken, and we, the survivors, had been chosen to carry out the last order of the Emperor, one last chance to redeem ourselves, to prove that we were not beyond saving. It had been nearly a month since the confrontation with Inquisitor Arcea, and every day since, I had felt the shadow of the warp tugging at me, clawing at the edges of my mind. The whispers had not faded, they never would, but now there was no time to doubt, no time to ask whether I was still worthy of redemption. We were being sent to Voltar Prime, a dying world on the fringes of the Imperium's influence, one that had fallen under the control of a chaos cult. The infection, the plague we had fought so hard to contain, had found new soil there, and this time it was spreading fast. It wasn't just the virus this time, it was the very essence of chaos, a perverse force that threatened to consume everything in its wake. I stood on the landing pad, watching the dropship prepare to launch. The sky was clouded, the air thick, with the same oppressive weight I had felt ever since the battle for our own world. The others, what was left of my squad, stood with me, silent, as the shuttle's engines hummed to life. Thaler, Dren and the rest were hardened, but their faces carried the same haunted look that I knew was in mine. "Do you think we can end this?" Dren asked quietly, his gaze fixed on the shuttle's hull as it rose into the air. "After everything we've seen?" I didn't answer him right away. The truth was, I didn't know. I had no idea whether the infection could truly be purged. But I knew one thing: if we failed, the consequences would be too great to bear. The warp's influence would spread further, swallowing more worlds, more lives. "I don't know," I said finally, my voice tight. "But we have to try." As we approached Voltar Prime, the signs of the infection were already evident. The planet's surface was a sickly shade of green, with patches of burnt-out cities scattered across the barren landscape. From the shuttle's viewport, I could see the chaos below: fires, plumes of smoke, the faint flicker of movement in the distance. The people were already lost, their fate sealed by the same malevolent forces that had nearly torn our own world apart. The mission was simple: destroy the chaos cult that had taken root, cleanse the planet, and eliminate the source of the infection before it spread beyond control. But simple missions were never as straightforward as they seemed. The landing zone was silent when we set down, the sound of the shuttle's engines fading as the doors opened. We disembarked quickly, weapons at the ready, and immediately began to move into the ruins of a city that had once thrived. The air here was thick with the stench of decay, the remnants of a once prosperous world now reduced to a wasteland. "Stay sharp," Thale said, his voice low and cautious. "We're not alone here." We moved quickly through the city's decaying streets, the sound of our boots echoing against the empty buildings. The deeper we went, the more oppressive the air became, as though the very atmosphere of the world had been corrupted by the warp. The city had been abandoned, but the signs of life, or something resembling life, were everywhere. Cracks in the walls, dark markings on the ground, strange symbols that twisted and writhed as though they were alive. It was a scene I had seen before, a place once filled with hope, now consumed by darkness. As we reached the central square, the full extent of the infection became clear. The cultists had transformed the area into a warped temple, a mockery of everything the Imperium stood for. Broken statues of the Emperor lay toppled on the ground, their faces desecrated, their bodies twisted into grotesque shapes. I could feel it, the presence, growing stronger as we neared the altar at the center. The air crackled with dark energy, the ground beneath our feet shifting and groaning. The warp was here, and it had left its mark. A sudden sound, an unnatural laugh, echoed through the square, cutting through the silence like a knife. I spun around, my laser gun raised, but there was nothing. Only shadows moving in the corners of my vision, flickering just out of reach. "We're being watched," I muttered. Dren nodded, his face tight with worry. "They know we're here." A figure emerged from the shadows, a man, or what was left of a man. His skin was pale, stretched tight across his bones, and his eyes were wide and bloodshot, filled with the taint of chaos. He stepped forward, his arms outstretched as though welcoming us. "You've come to save us," he said, his voice distorted, mocking. "But there is nothing left to save. The warp has already claimed this world, and you, guardsmen, are the next to be chosen." I gritted my teeth. This was no ordinary cultist. He was something more, something worse. The signs were unmistakable. He had been marked, transformed by the very chaos we had fought to contain. And now he was here, standing before us, an unholy messenger of the warp. The battle began quickly. The cultist, if he could even be called that, lunged at us, his twisted limbs moving with unnatural speed, his mouth screaming words of madness. Behind him, more figures emerged from the shadows, their bodies deformed, their eyes wild with the corruption of chaos. We fought with everything we had, but it felt different this time. The enemies we faced were not just men anymore. They were the embodiment of the warp's insidious influence, and every strike we made felt like it was pushing against a force far greater than any physical opponent. We were winning the battle, but the deeper we went into the city, the more I realized we weren't just fighting to destroy the cult. We were fighting for something deeper, our very souls. As we reached the heart of the city, the final push to the altar, I could feel the corruption trying to take root in me. The whispers were louder now, more insistent. The demonic presence from before seemed to follow me, clinging to my thoughts like a sickness. I was losing myself again. I shook my head, trying to clear my thoughts. I had to keep fighting. I had to prove that I could resist, that I could still hold on to who I was. But the choice was growing harder by the second. The corruption was everywhere, and I could feel it clawing at me from within, promising power, freedom, release. The altar stood before me, and as I raised my weapon, I saw something in the corner of my vision, an eye staring at me from the shadows, filled with an emptiness I recognized all too well. The taint had followed me here, and it was threatening to swallow me whole. I fired. The las bolt pierced the heart of the altar, and the world around us seemed to shudder. The ground cracked open, the warp's power twisting and thrashing, trying to pull us into its abyss. But in that moment, in the chaos and the darkness, I held on to something, myself. We had done it. The artifact, the source of the infection, was destroyed. But as we stood there in the aftermath, panting and covered in the blood of those we had fought, I knew the truth. The taint might have been purged from the planet, but I wasn't sure it could ever leave me. I wasn't sure I was me anymore. I had known it was coming. After everything we had faced, after everything we had done, there was no way the Inquisition would let us simply walk away. The blood we had spilled, the demons we had fought, the darkness we had unleashed, and the way we had sealed it all up. Or had we? No, there were too many unanswered questions, too many things left unsaid, things that couldn't be allowed to fester. And now the Inquisition had finally come. It started with a single message, a summons. I had expected a lot of things, but standing before the Inquisitor in that sterile, unforgiving chamber, I felt the weight of all our actions, all the deaths, crashing down on me. They had me standing there alone, in the center of the room, the flickering light of harsh lamps casting long shadows that twisted like the fingers of the warp itself. Inquisitor Varus, a man whose reputation preceded him, a man who had seen horrors worse than any I could imagine. He wasn't like the others I'd met in my service. No, this one had a coldness that came from experience, from knowledge. His gaze alone made me feel as though my soul was being stripped bare. "Corvin," he said, his voice quiet but sharp, his fingers tapping against the stone table. "You stand here not as a soldier of the Imperium, but as a suspect. Your actions, your decisions have brought about devastation. You and your squad were sent to eradicate a chaos infection, but instead, you unleashed something worse upon the galaxy." I didn't respond at first. The words felt like knives lodged in my chest, cutting deeper with each syllable. "What do you want from me?" I finally managed to ask, my voice hoarse. Varus looked at me with eyes that saw everything. "I want the truth. I want to understand what happened on that world, on Voltar Prime. What went wrong?" I could feel the walls closing in on me, the room growing smaller, darker, the air thick with the weight of his scrutiny. "We did what we had to do," I said, my voice more forceful than I had intended. "We stopped the infection. We saved the planet. You destroyed the artifact, he interrupted, leaning forward. But tell me, Corvin, did you destroy it completely? Or did you merely contain it? Did you truly stop the infection? Or did you seal it away, waiting for it to return? I have seen what comes from such careless actions. The warp does not forgive. The warp does not forget. His words were like poison, seeping into my mind, making me question everything. I knew he was right. I had failed to destroy the source completely. The taint was still there, in the depths of my thoughts. I had not purged it. I had only pushed it back. I didn't mean for any of this to happen, I muttered, the weight of it all beginning to crush me. We thought we could contain it. I thought it was over. Varus narrowed his eyes. That's the problem. You thought. And when you thought, you didn't think enough. You were reckless. And now we are paying the price. The warp's influence was never meant to be contained by your kind. And yet you sealed it with your own hands, with the very hands that should have destroyed it. He paused, letting the silence stretch between us. And now, Corvin, I will ask you again. Do you believe you have truly cleansed Voltar Prime? Do you believe you are free of the taint? The room felt like it was closing in on me. I couldn't breathe. The questions were too much. Had I done enough? Had I? Number I hadn't, not even close. I thought about Dren, about Thaler, about the others. Were they still with me? Or had they been changed too? And what about me? The more I thought, the more I realized that the warp had never been fully purged. It had touched us all, and I had let it. I could feel the eyes of the Inquisitor on me, watching, waiting for an answer, but I couldn't give him one. Do you know what you have done, Corvin? Varus asked, his voice lower now, more threatening. Do you understand the ramifications of your actions, the ripple effects of your failure? I clenched my fists, trying to steady myself. I didn't fail. I stopped the infection. I ended it. But I could feel it. The truth deep down, gnawing at my insides. The infection hadn't ended. It had spread, in ways I couldn't yet understand. I had seen it. I had felt it. The presence of the warp was still there, still lurking in the corners of my mind, still whispering, still waiting. I had not stopped it. I had embraced it. I was lying to him. I was lying to myself. Varus stood up suddenly, the cold clang of his boots on the stone floor echoing in the silence. He moved toward a set of data slates and activated one, tapping a few commands. The screens flickered, displaying a series of images of other worlds, other systems. The reports had been clear. The infection had spread. New rifts, new cults, new signs of demonic influence. The same symptoms, the same corruption. The worlds were falling. He turned the slate toward me, showing a map of the galaxy with regions highlighted in red. Look, he said, his tone now cold and calculating. These systems are being lost. The infection is spreading, not just through planets, but through entire sectors. The warp's taint is leaving marks on everything it touches. And I fear that the disaster you thought you ended on Voltar Prime was only the beginning. My heart skipped a beat as I saw the map. Each red region a burning scar in the galaxy, a sign of the chaos we had unwittingly unleashed. You thought it was over, Varus continued, his voice dropping to a whisper. You thought that by destroying the artifact you had sealed the warp's power, but you were wrong. You cannot destroy the warp. It only sleeps and it waits. And now it calls, Corvin. It calls to you, to me, to everyone who has been touched by it. I stared at the screen, at the worlds marked in red, and the chilling truth hit me like a physical blow. The warp hadn't been defeated. It had only changed form, and I had been its unwilling vessel. The Inquisitor's gaze softened, just slightly, as he looked at me. The question now is not whether you failed. That is already decided. The question is, can you resist it? Can you resist the call of the warp even now? I stood in silence, the weight of his words settling in my chest. He was right. I had failed, and now I had to face the consequences. But there was one thing I had to cling to, my soul, or what was left of it. The Inquisitor left me standing there, alone in the cold chamber. His words echoed in my mind, louder than the whispers of the warp. I wasn't free, I wasn't even close, but I had one chance left, one last chance to prove that I could still fight. to prove that I was still human. I didn't know if I could resist the call of the warp, but I would try. The air was heavy with the stench of blood, rot, and ash. The once vibrant world had become nothing but a fading memory, replaced by a corrupted wasteland, an unholy reflection of the forces we had so foolishly thought we could contain. It was ironic, really. We had fought so hard to seal the darkness away, and now the very darkness was coming to claim us. I stood at the edge of the battlefield, my boots sinking into the charred earth. Around me, the remnants of what had once been my squad, what was left of us, prepared for the final push. Our weapons were ready, our minds hardened by the trials we had endured, but we all knew one thing. This was the end. There would be no coming back from this. We had learned over time that the infection we thought we had destroyed was only the beginning. The warp had spread, and with it, the taint of chaos. As it always did, the warp twisted everything it touched, and the enemies we once faced, those corrupted by the virus, had become something far worse. The time had come. The rift was opening again, and we had only one mission left, to confront the source of the infection. The enemy was waiting for us. I could feel their presence before I saw them. A shadow in the distance, a mass of writhing forms, their corrupted bodies shifting, undulating as though they were not truly of this world. Chaos had taken root here. It had become a living, breathing nightmare, and I knew that I wasn't just facing enemies of flesh and bone anymore. I was fighting my own demons, the ones that had followed me ever since we sealed that artifact. The taint was inside me, like a slow-burning fire, and no matter how hard I tried, I could never shake it. "We need to move," Dren said, his voice tight, almost hollow. I glanced at him, his once bright eyes now clouded with uncertainty. The warp had touched him too, just as it had touched the rest of us. He had grown distant, consumed by the fear that gripped all of us, but especially him. Thale stood nearby, his weapon raised, his posture rigid. He had been quiet for days now, and I could see the change in him. The confidence we had once relied on seemed to have slipped away. He was haunted, just like me. "I don't know if we're ready for this," I admitted, the words barely escaping my lips. "I don't know if we can win this." "We have no choice," Thal replied, his voice hard. "We've come this far. We have to finish what we started." I nodded grimly, clenching my fists. The battle was inevitable, but I wasn't sure I was prepared to face it, to face what had become of us. As we advanced, the ground trembled beneath us. The air became thick, filled with a suffocating, unnatural energy. We crossed through a ruined cityscape, its once grand structures now twisted by the influence of the warp. The very buildings seemed to pulse with dark energy, bending and warping like they were alive. And then we saw them, the Chaos cultists. Their once human forms were now corrupted beyond recognition, their bodies mutilated, their minds shattered by the unholy power they had embraced. They stood at the heart of the rift, chanting in unison, their words a twisted language that only the damned could understand. The ground around them was blackened, cracked open by the sheer weight of the warp's influence. At their center, a figure stood, tall, imposing, surrounded by a halo of flickering flames. Its face was hidden behind a helmet, its body wrapped in dark, flowing robes, but I could feel its presence, its power. This was the one we had to defeat, the source of all the corruption, the master of the Chaos cult. Before we could move closer, the ground before us shifted. From the shadows, figures emerged, our old comrades, twisted by the same virus we had fought against. They were no longer the soldiers we had once fought beside. They were chaos-bound husks, their bodies altered beyond recognition, their eyes vacant, dead, and yet I knew them. "Thaler," I whispered, my heart sinking. "It's them, the others." He turned to me, his eyes filled with sorrow and fear. I can't fight them. We had all been touched by the warp. Some of us had resisted, but others, like the soldiers before us, had embraced it. And now, those we had known, those we had fought beside, were now our enemies. They were lost. The battle began in an instant. Laser gun fire, bolter shots, and the growl of chainswords filled the air as we fought for our lives. My own weapon roared to life as I opened fire on the corrupted soldiers, but even as I shot them down, I could feel the sickness growing within me. The whispers were louder now, gnawing at my thoughts, urging me to join them, to embrace the power of chaos. I stumbled, my weapon shaking in my hands, as a voice whispered in my ear, "Join us. You are one of us now." I could feel the pull, the temptation, and for a moment I almost gave in. But then I saw them, Thalie, Dren, and the others, fighting with everything they had, refusing to succumb to the darkness. They were still fighting for something, for us. Number, I couldn't let them fall. I fired again, the bolt piercing the chest of one of the corrupted soldiers. They were falling, but so were we. Each shot took more out of me. Each blow was another reminder of the cost. The rift, the corruption, was consuming us, and I wasn't sure we could hold on much longer. We reached the center of the rift, where the leader of the Chaos cult stood. The air crackled with power, and I felt it, a force beyond anything I had experienced before. The rift was a gateway pulling at us, trying to drag us into the warp's embrace. "Corvin." The voice came from behind me. I turned to see Dren, bloodied, his face pale. "It's too late, we've already lost. Look at us." I could see it then, the taint in him, in all of us. The corruption had taken root, and no matter how hard we fought, we couldn't escape it. But there was one last thing I could do. With a final push, we closed in on the Chaos leader. I raised my weapon, the last of my strength pushing me forward. The leader turned to face me, and I saw the malevolent smile beneath the helmet, the eyes glowing with unholy fire. "You think you can stop this?" it asked, its voice a twisted mockery of humanity. "You are nothing but pawns. The warp's influence will never be defeated. It is eternal." I raised my gun. "We're all eternal," I said, my voice hoarse but resolute. With a single shot, I ended it. The explosion of light sent a shockwave through the battlefield, and the ground trembled violently. The rift began to collapse, and the dark figure before me crumbled into ash. We stood amidst the wreckage, the last remnants of the Chaos cult falling away as the warp's influence began to dissipate. The battle was over. The planet had been saved. But as I looked around, I realized the truth. We had lost more than just the battle. We had lost ourselves. I didn't know if I could ever escape the taint of chaos, but for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I had made a choice. I had faced my demons. The battle was over. The rift had closed. The ashes of the Chaos cult smoldered in the wind, their dark presence vanquished from the planet. But as the dust settled, the weight of what we had done, what we had lost, crushed me harder than the destruction of the enemy. I stood alone at the edge of the battlefield, looking out over the ruins of what had once been a thriving world. The cities, now nothing more than charred skeletons, seemed to stretch endlessly into the horizon. The air, still thick with the stench of death, was heavy with a sense of finality, as though the planet itself had been swallowed by the warp and spat out as a hollow shell. The sky, once a vivid blue, was now a sickly grey, as if even the heavens had been scarred by the horrors we had unleashed. We had fought for survival, for the future, for the Emperor's will, but as I surveyed the devastation, I couldn't shake the gnawing feeling in the pit of my stomach. Had we truly saved this world, or had we merely delayed the inevitable? The warp's corruption had touched this place, its foul influence seeping into every corner of the planet, corrupting everything it came into contact with. And yet I could not shake the thought that the infection we had fought so desperately to contain was just a symptom of a far deeper sickness, one that ran through the very veins of the Imperium itself. I walked through the wreckage, my boots crunching on the charred earth. The others were busy clearing the remains of the cultists, gathering what was left of our fallen comrades. Their bodies, desecrated by the forces of chaos, had become part of the landscape, just another casualty in the never-ending war. And as I looked at them, I realized that I had never truly known what it meant to win. The galaxy had taught me that war was inevitable, that the fight for the Emperor's will was endless, but no one had ever told me what it would cost. The price of victory was measured in blood, in souls, in shattered ideals. Corvin. I turned to find Thale standing behind me, his face tired, his eyes haunted. The others had gathered around the wreckage of the altar, but Thaler had stayed behind. He seemed almost distant, like a part of him had stayed behind with the fallen soldiers, lost in the haze of war. He caught my eye and shook his head. I don't know if I can keep doing this. Can you? His voice was quiet, as though he was speaking more to himself than to me. I didn't have an answer for him. How could I? I felt the same way, lost in this war, uncertain of what we were fighting for, the Emperor's will, or the survival of a dying empire rotting from the inside out. The others had begun to gather the survivors, but I remained rooted to the spot, unable to move. It felt as though the ground itself was pulling me deeper into the dirt, into the very heart of this cursed world. I could hear the faint hum of the Vox equipment in the distance, the crackling voices of command transmitting orders. "Prepare for evacuation," the voice instructed. "We're sending reinforcements to assist with the cleanup. Secure the survivors and report your findings." The orders were mechanical, devoid of any emotion, as though the destruction around us was just another blip in the ongoing war effort. And as I listened, I wondered, what were we really fighting for? We had stopped the infection. We had destroyed the Chaos artifact, but at what cost? The warp's influence had not just touched the people of Voltar Prime, it had reached us, it had changed us, and now we were being told to move on, to forget what had happened, to continue the fight. But how could we? How could I? As we prepared to leave, I found myself standing on the edge of the battlefield once more, looking out over the destruction, the rubble, the ashes, the endless fields of bodies. It all seemed so meaningless now. This world, this war, it had all led to this, to a planet torn apart, its people lost and its legacy forever tainted. I felt a heavy weight on my chest, a crushing realization that had been building for days, for weeks. The Imperium wasn't just a beacon of hope, it was a machine, a vast, uncaring force that consumed everything in its path. It had always been like this. The Emperor's will had always been a means to an end, a justification for the endless slaughter. And we were the instruments of that slaughter. We were the ones who had carried out the orders, the ones who had fought for a cause that now felt hollow. I heard footsteps behind me and turned to find Drain walking toward me. His face was ashen, his eyes distant, but there was something else there, a look of resignation, of understanding. "We did what we had to do," he said softly. "We stopped the virus, we stopped the infection." But the words felt empty, hollow. "I don't know if we did," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "I think we just delayed the inevitable. We've saved one world, Dren, but what about all the others? What happens when the next infection comes? What happens when the warp's influence spreads further?" He didn't respond. There was nothing left to say. As we boarded the transport to leave Voltar Prime, I looked back one last time. The planet, once full of life, now lay in ruins. The fires of chaos had been extinguished, but the scars it left behind would never fade. And as I stared out the window of the shuttle, I couldn't help but wonder if we were any better than the cultists we had fought. We had fought to protect the Imperium, but in doing so we had been forced to sacrifice everything. Our morals, our humanity, and perhaps even our souls. The planet was saved, but we were not. The journey back was silent. The transport hummed along, carrying the remnants of our squad, the survivors of Voltar Prime. But it felt as though the victory was fleeting, as though we had lost more than we had gained. I tried to cling to the thought that we had done the right thing, that we had stopped the warp's spread. But the truth was, I wasn't sure anymore. The Imperium was a broken machine, its gears grinding us all down to dust, and I wasn't sure that we were ever more than another cog in the wheel. The warp wasn't just an enemy. It was a force that had seeped into everything, into us, into the very fabric of the Imperium itself. And the more I thought about it, the more I realized we were all infected. The transport doors hissed open, and the familiar sight of the base we had once called home loomed ahead. It was supposed to feel like a return to safety. It was supposed to feel like redemption, a place where we could finally rest, where we could heal the wounds that had been carved into us. But instead, as I stepped off the shuttle, it felt like stepping into the very heart of the warp itself. The base was quiet, too quiet. The sun, once warm and comforting, hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the barracks and training yards. The familiar walls now felt cold and oppressive, as if they had absorbed the darkness we had brought with us. The once vibrant flags that fluttered in the wind now hung limp, their colours muted by the thick, creeping fog that seemed to cling to the ground, like the remnants of a forgotten nightmare. I glanced over at Dren and Thyle, both of them looking just as unsettled as I felt. We had been here before, years ago, when everything had seemed simpler. But that was before the virus, before the warp's influence had touched us all, leaving its mark on everything we had known. It doesn't feel like home anymore, Thyle muttered under his breath. His eyes scanned the surroundings, almost as if he was waiting for something to jump out of the shadows. Dren didn't respond. He didn't need to. We were all thinking the same thing. We had come here to try and find answers, to attempt one final push to purge the planet's lingering corruption. But in the back of my mind, I could feel it, the truth we hadn't wanted to face. The virus might have been contained, but the warp's influence, its mark, could never truly be erased. The command center was just as empty as the rest of the base, the walls lined with untouched equipment. Orders had been given to purify the planet, to ensure that the chaos influence did not seep through the cracks again. We had come here to supervise the final stages of the cleansing, to oversee the destruction of any remnants of the chaos cult. But now, I wondered if it would ever truly be enough. The Vox units crackled to life, their distorted voices cutting through the silence. "Purge teams are in position," one of the officers on the line reported. "We are ready to begin the final phase. Proceed with caution. The warp's presence is still strong in certain sectors." I felt a chill run down my spine as I listened to the voice. The warp's presence was never truly gone. Even now, as the Imperium's forces mobilized to cleanse the planet, the echoes of chaos remained, lurking just beneath the surface. We traveled to the purification zones in silence, our boots heavy on the ground, each step echoing with the weight of what we had already lost. As we approached the outskirts of the city, I could see the purification teams setting up their equipment. Massive machines capable of purging any trace of chaos hummed ominously, their cold mechanical eyes scanning the horizon. "We're almost done," I heard Dren whisper. "Just a few more days, and we can leave this behind." But the words didn't comfort me. I looked around, my eyes scanning the sky, the land, searching for something I couldn't quite name. A sign, a warning. We entered the city's heart, where the most intense purging efforts were being made. The team leader, a cold, calculating officer with eyes that never seemed to blink, explained the process. "We're using the Emperor's flame. Nothing will remain. The warp's mark will be erased." I nodded numbly, but deep down I knew it wasn't that simple. Even as the purging began, flames licking the sky, the smell of burning corruption filling the air, I could still feel it. The warp, like a stain, lingering beneath the surface. I thought of the night we had spent battling the infection, fighting against the very essence of chaos. I thought of the soldiers who had died and the ones who had become monsters, twisted by the infection. I thought of the battles we had fought and the price we had paid. And in the back of my mind, I heard the whisper again, faint but insistent. "It is never over." We had been here before, but now, as I watched the city burn, it felt different. There was no triumph, no sense of victory. The flames that consumed the city were supposed to cleanse it, to purify it, but instead, they felt like a funeral pyre. I looked over at Dren, his eyes distant, his hands shaking. "Do you think it will ever end?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer at first, and when he did, his voice was hollow, like it was coming from someone else entirely. "It can't, not really. The warp is a part of this world now. We've fought it, but it's never truly gone. Not for us. We spent the next several hours coordinating the purging efforts, overseeing the destruction of the corrupted structures, and making sure the final traces of the cult were wiped from existence. But as the last fires burned and the city's ruins were reduced to ash, I couldn't help but feel a sinking sense of despair. The planet might have been saved, the infection might have been contained, but the cost was too high. The warp had left its mark not just on the planet, but on all of us. It had twisted our bodies, our minds, and our souls, and no amount of fire, no amount of cleansing could ever undo what had been done. We returned to the base at dusk, the once familiar walls now a prison, the shadows longer and more oppressive than ever. I looked out across the ruins, the smoke rising into the sky like the last remnants of a forgotten nightmare. And then I heard it, a faint whisper on the wind. You can never escape it. I turned around, but no one was there. The others were still inside, preparing for the final debriefing. I stood alone, the weight of the words hanging heavy in the air. It wasn't over. The warp's influence would never truly leave me. It had marked us all, and no amount of purging, no amount of fire could change that. The sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows over the battlefield that we had once fought to save. The ruins of Voltar Prime were silent now, the fires of chaos reduced to embers, but there was no peace to be found in this silence. It was an unsettling calm, a quiet that only served to amplify the thoughts that had been gnawing at me for so long. I sat atop a shattered piece of debris, my rifle resting at my side, the weight of it a reminder of everything I had done and everything I had lost. I looked out over the city, now little more than a smoldering ruin. The planet was dead, its soul torn asunder by the influence of the warp. The infection had been contained, yes, but at what cost? The Emperor's will? Or had we been nothing more than instruments of his endless war, pawns in a game too vast for us to understand? The question lingered in my mind, unanswered, like an unspoken prayer. Was this truly the Emperor's will? Was this the fate that awaited every soldier who followed his path? Was this my fate? I had fought and I had won. We had driven back the tide of chaos. We had purged the planet, extinguished the cultists, and sealed the rift. But now, standing in the ashes of victory, I was left with a haunting emptiness. I had felt the warp touch me, feel its whispers creep into my thoughts, its claws sinking into my soul. I had resisted, fought it at every turn. But now I wasn't so sure. The others had left me behind. Dren, Thale, and the rest had returned to their duties, to their orders, to the endless cycle. But I stayed. I couldn't leave this place, this scar on the galaxy. This place had marked me, had changed me. I didn't know if I could ever go back to what I was. My hands trembled, and I clenched them into fists, trying to force the feeling back, but it wouldn't go away. It never would. The voice in my head had grown louder, more insistent with each passing day. At first, I thought it was just the fatigue, the stress of the battle. But now I knew better. It wasn't just the war that had changed me. It was the taint of the warp. It had seeped into me, into everything I had become. I'd thought I could resist, that I could hold on to the Emperor's light, to his justice, to the righteousness of my cause. But now, after everything, I wasn't sure what that light had ever been. Had I really been fighting for the Emperor? Or had I been fighting to preserve something else? Something darker? Something that we all pretended wasn't there? I stood up slowly, my legs stiff from days of sitting in one spot, my mind racing. I had once believed that my purpose was simple. Fight for the Imperium, defend the Emperor's will, uphold the faith. But now I wasn't so sure anymore. The darkness I had fought, the corruption I had tried to destroy, it was inside me, and no amount of fire or cleansing would change that. I walked through the remains of Voltar Prime, the landscape bleak and lifeless. The air was thick with the scent of burnt flesh, a reminder of the death we had wrought. It didn't feel like a victory. It felt like a grave. The ashes of the dead, the rubble of a civilization that once thrived, it was all gone. And I, who had stood among those who had fought for the Emperor's will, now wondered if that will was ever more than just a tool for power. My thoughts were interrupted by a faint whisper, a voice on the wind. the faintest echo of what had been my own name, barely audible, but unmistakable. I stopped in my tracks, my heart hammering in my chest. I wasn't alone. I could feel it, the warp still lingering in the air, still calling to me. And then I heard it more clearly, a voice I knew all too well. "Join us." I shook my head violently, trying to push it out of my mind, but the voice continued, whispering promises of power, of freedom, of release from this endless war. It was the same voice I had heard countless times, the same whispers that had pulled at me when I fought in the trenches, when I stood before the rift, when I watched my comrades fall. It was a voice of seduction, a voice that promised peace, but it was a lie. I had learned that much in the darkness. I reached the edge of the city, where the ground gave way to an expanse of blackened earth. In the distance, I could see the remnants of the rift we had sealed, the place where it all began. I stood there, staring at the scar in the planet's surface, feeling the pull of the warp like a magnet, drawing me closer. The final test was here, the ultimate choice. I could walk away. I could leave this place behind, forget the taint that had marked me, and return to my duty. I could return to the Imperium, to the fight, to the lie that everything would be okay. I could ignore the whispers, ignore the corruption, and pretend I had been redeemed. But I knew the truth. I reached into my pack and pulled out the last relic I had carried with me, the purity seal, the one I had received at the beginning of my journey. It was worn and faded, its edges frayed, but it still bore the symbol of the Emperor. I had carried it with me through every battle, every horror, every trial. I looked at the seal in my hand, feeling the weight of it, the weight of all the lives I had taken, all the lives I had failed to save. And in that moment, I realized that I was no longer the man who had started this journey. I had changed. I had been broken by the warp, twisted by the chaos that had seeped into my very soul. But I wasn't done yet. I held the purity seal up high, the symbol of the Emperor's light, and I made a choice, a final defiance against the dark force that had tried to claim me. With a cry of resolve, I threw the seal into the air, watching it twist and burn in the winds of the warp before it disintegrated, turning to ash. The final act had been done. The choice was made. I had embraced the darkness, but now I had cast it aside. I wasn't sure if I had won, but for the first time in what felt like forever, I felt free. The whispers were gone, drowned out by the fire of defiance that burned in my heart. I didn't know what would happen next. I didn't know if I was redeemed, if I was still worthy of the Emperor's light. But I knew this. I had taken the first step, and in that step, I had chosen to fight for something more than the Imperium. I had chosen to fight for my soul. The transport rumbled beneath my feet, the sound of its engines a constant hum in the background, but it did nothing to drown out the storm inside my head. I sat alone, looking out of the viewport, watching as the stars streaked by like fleeting dreams, distant, cold, indifferent. The galaxy was vast, and yet it felt so small, suffocatingly small, as if I was trapped in an endless cycle I could never escape. I had thought that when it was all over, when the battle was done, I would find peace. But there was no peace to be found, not for me. The horrors we had faced on Voltar Prime were still fresh in my mind. The screams of the infected, the twisted faces of our fallen comrades, the promises of chaos that had nearly dragged me into the abyss. The warp had touched me. It had left its mark, and no matter how hard I tried to scrub it away, I could still feel its presence within me, just beneath the surface. I had cast aside the purity seal, defied the taint, but now, as I sat aboard this shuttle, I questioned whether any of it had truly mattered. Had I done enough to rid myself of the darkness, or was I forever bound to it, a puppet of the warp, no matter how far I ran? The answer eluded me, and perhaps it always would. The mission briefing had been short, almost curt. A new planet, a new outbreak of chaos corruption. The Imperium had wasted no time sending its most capable. Those who had survived Voltar Prime, those who had seen the darkness and lived to tell the tale. We were the last line of defense, the final bulwark against a galaxy slowly succumbing to the pull of the warp. But as I thought about the mission ahead, I wondered if this would be my last. Would I die fighting, like so many others before me? Or would I fall, not to the enemy's blade, but to the madness creeping within my own mind. The shuttle jolted as it entered the atmosphere, the roar of the engines growing louder as we descended toward the planet's surface. I could see the barren landscape below, mountains, wastelands, and the flickering remnants of cities now abandoned, slowly being consumed by the chaos that had taken root. The briefing had mentioned something about a cult, a rising faction of heretics seeking to harness the power of the warp. It didn't matter what they wanted. What mattered was that they had to be stopped. If I had learned anything, it was that the Imperium would not forgive failure. But as we prepared for the landing, I couldn't shake the feeling that this would be different. I had already fought and bled for the Emperor's will. What more could I give? The landing gear thudded against the planet's surface and the shuttle's doors hissed open. The cold, dry air hit me like a slap in the face, sharp and unwelcoming. The ground was cracked, scorched, as though the planet itself had been scarred by something far worse than mere war. I could see the remnants of old fortifications in the distance, long abandoned and overtaken by the creeping vines of chaos. I wasn't alone, of course. My squad, what was left of it, disembarked behind me, their faces hardened by the years of fighting. Dren, Thale, and the others had joined me on this mission. But I could see it in their eyes. They too were wondering if this was the end. And why wouldn't they? After everything we'd been through, who could still believe in the Emperor's will? The galaxy was burning, and all we could do was stand at the edge, staring into the inferno, hoping we wouldn't be consumed. "Stay sharp," I said, my voice hoarse from the dust in the air. "We don't know what's waiting for us down there." Dren gave me a grim nod, and Thale looked at me like he was seeing something different in my eyes, something darker perhaps, but there was nothing to say. We were soldiers and we had a job to do. The first few days were uneventful, and yet every night I found myself waking from nightmares. I could see the faces of my fallen comrades, their eyes empty, staring at me, accusing me. The whispers of the warp followed me wherever I went, and I couldn't escape them. Not even here, on this distant world, as I stood among the ruins of a broken city, did I find solace. The same corruption that had ravaged Voltar Prime seemed to be growing here, festering just beneath the surface. I knew what I had to do. But as I prepared to face the new threat, chaos cultists, mutants, horrors, I couldn't shake the thought that this would be my last fight. Would I be consumed by the darkness, or would I burn it away, just as I had once hoped to do on Voltar Prime? The next day, as we advanced deeper into the infected city, I felt the pull of the warp again. It wasn't just the whispers, it was something worse. It was the feeling of being watched, the sensation that something was lurking in the shadows, waiting for me to slip. I turned to Dren, but his face had hardened, his eyes distant. "They're out there," he muttered, "and we're walking right into their trap." We all knew it was coming. The cultists would try to stop us, they always did. But it wasn't just them I feared. It was what we had become, what I had become. The warp had marked me, and no matter how much I fought it, I knew the truth. It was never truly gone. We marched onward, not knowing if this world would be our salvation or our grave. But one thing was certain, the war was far from over, and the warp would always be waiting. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the unknown. The fight is far from over, and the echoes of chaos will always linger. If you found yourself captivated by this tale, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to stay updated on the next chapter of this dark journey. Your support helps bring these stories to life. Together, we can face the darkness no matter how far it reaches. The Emperor protects, but can we protect ourselves from the shadows that follow us?